Good evening, everybody. Today is Monday, May 21st, and this is a Moscow City regular council meeting. With that, Arthur?
Yeah, would you rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Art. Okay, moving on to the next thing, which is the Emergency Medical Services Proclamation. Whereas emergency medical services are a vital component to public service, and whereas the members of the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department and Ambulance Company are ready to provide life-saving care to those in need 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and whereas access to high-quality emergency care dramatically improves the survival and recovery rate of those to experience sudden illness or injury, and whereas the members of the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department and Ambulance Company is made up of volunteer emergency medical technicians, paramedics, firefighters, and trained members of the public, and whereas the members of these teams engage in countless hours of specialized training and continuing education to enhance their life-saving skills, and whereas it is appropriate to recognize the value and the accomplishments of the emergency medical services to the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department and Ambulance Company by designating Emergency Medical Services Week. Now, therefore, I, Bill Lambert, the mayor of the city of Moscow, do hereby proclaim the week of May 20th through 2018 Emergency Medical Service. I said 20, should have been 2026, not 2016. In the city of Moscow, and I encourage our public to thank these volunteers. And with that, I have Debbie Karskelian as well as Chief Nickerson here to accept this.
Pulling their pants up. Both of them.
Come on, rabbit ears.
Stand what you need, squeeze me up.
There's 1, 2, 3. Let's try one more. 1, 2, 3.
You know to speak. You know to say anything? Huh? You like well, so.
That's awesome.
Ladies and gentlemen, I offer everybody a chance to get one of these proclamations read or the works that they do within our city for our community, an opportunity and a chance to speak. And so I will say this, both Debbie and Brian, they just get the job done, as does our volunteers, and we got a bunch of them in this city. And I recognize that as the mayor, as does this council, and we certainly appreciate all the work and efforts that the men and women do from the ambulance service and our firefighters. So thank you very much. With that, I will move on to the consent agenda.
I move approval of the consent agenda as presented.
Second.
Okay, I think Gina beat you, Catherine.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, we got a motion by Art and a second by Gina to approve the consent agenda. I'll start the roll with Brandy.
Aye.
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 Okay. We will move on to item number 2, staff recognition report. Gary, do you have anything for us tonight, sir?
Nothing this evening, sir.
Okay, number 3, mayoral appointments, and I do not have any this evening, so we will move right into item number 4, which is public comment and response period, which we allow 15 minutes at each council meeting for this. As long as it isn't anything in front of the council this evening and or in front of planning and zoning or Board of Adjustments, please come up and tell us what is on your mind. We'll give you 3 minutes, state your name and address, and let us know what your concerns are. Everybody's let me off the hook early and easy tonight, so I will move on to item number 5, which is a public hearing amendment of Title IV, Chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 11, and 12 of the Moscow City Code regarding the use table ordinance. Michael Ray will present. Good evening, Mike.
Evening, Your Honor, council members.
Before you tonight, we have a public hearing, just amending certain chapters within the zoning code in order to accommodate the use table ordinance. So just to give you a little bit of background, this is really just the conversion of the zoning code from its current format, which is primarily a narrative format, into a table format. It does clean up significant inconsistencies. We have term inconsistencies, definition inconsistencies, and use inconsistencies within the code as it currently exists today. It also provides that side-by-side comparison once it's broken out into table format of the uses as well as the districts. And we've got another conversion of commercial uses to the 2012 North American Industry Classification System. And that's really just the standard used in North America in order to classify business establishments. And I just want to take a moment to highlight kind of the work of the Planning and Zoning Commission. They've put in a little, under a couple years of work on this project. Started it in September of 2016. Conducted 25 public commission meetings where they discussed the use table ordinance and worked through all the little intricacies of moving the sections and creating the table and all that's involved. And then there's a public hearing that happened on April 11th. 2018. So they put in quite a bit of work over the last little under a couple years on this project. So I think the best way to go through this, instead of page by page, go through our 117 pages of this ordinance, is just to go through table of contents, and I'll just give a broad overview of each section, and then if you have any questions, we can dig into the code and certainly explain in a little more detail. So Chapter 1 is really the general provisions section of our zoning code. There's title, authority, purpose, comp plan, adoption, really the scope of the zoning code. And the primary change within Chapter 1 is going to be the shifting of the definitions section from Chapter 11 to Chapter 1. And we also have the NIACS conversion to a lot of those commercial use definitions within that section. We do have nonconformities, which rounds out the remainder of the chapter. So Chapter 2 is our zoning districts. It replaced residential zoning districts. So previously we had it broken down into Chapter 2 was residential, and Chapter 3 was commercial, and Chapter 4 was special zoning districts. And so now we've combined pretty much the residential, the commercial, as well as the special into Chapter 2, just calling it zoning districts. So establishments of zoning districts, so we haven't...
Before you go, just to help everybody in case they're following along, of where we are in the packet, starts on page 124.
Okay.
It
Thank you.
starts
Somebody-
actually on page 136.
No, where
It
he's going
goes
through the
to-
general provisions and the chapters.
And it goes to like 150.
No, I'm just talking about this particular one. He said he wanted to not go through the old stuff of where all the strike through was, and just go to where the new stuff is.
Carry on, Mike.
I didn't mean to be disrespectful. I just wanted to say you're on those pages.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to stop me and we can go over it. But beginning of Chapter 2, so we have some sections that are moved from other chapters within the zoning code. So as for instance, establishments of zoning districts made more sense in order to relocate it here to the beginning of Chapter 2. Adoption of Moscow zoning map, nothing's really changed here. It's just been relocated from Chapter 1 as well. Rules for determination of zoning districts, once again, moved from Chapter 11. District purposes really only includes purpose statements, and so what we've done is when we've broken out, so generally what you had before with each zoning district was that you had all the permitted uses followed by the conditionally permitted uses, specially permitted uses, accessory uses, and then you had all the bulk and dimensional standards. So you had lot size, lot width, setback requirements, building heights, and then you had limitations on uses, which is special restrictions for certain uses or certain zones. And so we've broken those all out into table format. And so what you're left with is district purposes. And really the district purposes explain what the intention of the district is for and really guide you in the application of that zoning district. So when you're going through a rezone, for instance, it helps guide you in appropriate locations for where a zone, would be appropriate in the city. So we retained all those purpose statements. Most of those are what you have right now. I think only a couple of them have changed slightly, but most of them remain the same. So, it goes through all of our residential zones. Really no changes there. And then we have the addition of the commercial zones to Chapter 2. And so these have all been relocated from Chapter 3 in order to be into Chapter 2 here. And then at the very end, we've got University Zoning District, and that just happened to be in the Special Zoning Districts chapter, Chapter 4, and so that's been relocated and placed underneath the rest of the zones. And we ended up creating an overlay and specific plan district. So the Legacy Crossing overlay was previously in Chapter 4. It's not really a zoning district, it's an overlay zone. And so we wanted to draw a distinction there and then set the tone for any other overlay zones that we could possibly have in the future. And so wanted to go through kind of general provisions, how do those interrelate between the underlying zoning district and the overlay zone? What takes precedence when there's a conflict? Those, things of that nature are laid out in the general provisions section. And then we've got Legacy Crossing overlay, which, like I mentioned, was relocated from Chapter 4. And so nothing's changed there for the Legacy Crossing overlay district. That's remained the same. Brings us to Chapter 3. So previously commercial zoning districts. Now this is just permitted land uses. So this is where we introduce the land use table. And this is a new section to introduce the table. Interpretations of the land use table. So we've added a section, talks about a lot of the acronyms, what they mean, the symbols. Conditional use permit, permitted use, permitted accessory use, and really explains the interpretation of the land use table. Authorized uses, one of those sections we've relocated in this circumstance, Chapter 11, relocated it here to a more appropriate location. Then that brings us to the land use table. So we have this brand new table with all of our listed uses, and this was the outcome of that. And I know the commission spent numerous meetings on looking at different iterations in order to, draw a distinction and make this more user-friendly to everybody. And really looked at a lot of other examples of other municipalities, and I, may be biased, but this is, I think, one of the best ones out there. It really, allows for ease of use and really, a good way to convey all the requirements. And so you see the zoning districts up at the top of the table. Goes through, have a break in residential to commercial zones, and then it is the remainder of the commercial zones there on the right. Start out with residential uses, so you run through all of the residential uses, and they're grouped by category too. So we have some dwellings in commercial zones, group living, so fraternities, sororities, dorms, and then accessory uses down here, and all the different special requirements for different types of accessory buildings or structures or uses. And then you go over and you can tell where they're allowed or not, so conditionally permitted use, permitted accessory use. So you can easily go through the matrix of the table here and look at what zone you're looking for. Well, I want dorms, and where's that going to be located in what zone? So instead of flipping through chapter by chapter, zone by zone, the way we currently have it, it's really a kind of a one-stop shop in order to be able to find that information. So further on down, we go through non-residential uses, and this is where grouping it by business type, category, really helps. So we've got all these headings: agricultural uses, amusement, recreation facilities. Somebody coming to town or somebody in town looking at operating a fitness center. It's easy to scroll down fitness centers, and then you can go across and see which zones you need to be looking at for the property. And so really helpful. And then we've got the NIACS codes here where they're applicable for all the commercial uses where we've defined them. And so it's easy reference if you need to, those are also in the definition section, so you can cross-reference those there and go online and look at further information if you don't necessarily see what you're looking for within the definition section. So we really have a few pages of use table, and then we've got at the very end, these use elements and exceedance, bulk and dimensional requirements. And so exceedance of maximum building height, we ended up putting that here. So for institutional uses, in residential zones, a lot of times they'll, just because of the size of these structures, they'll almost always exceed the maximum building height for the zone. And so we have that down here, and through the conditional use permit process, you can go through, which is more appropriate than going through the variance process. Those are really unique circumstances for variances. And then drive-through facilities is down there as well. We want to regulate those mainly for traffic issues in certain zones and certain areas. And then we have a lot of these superscripts that you see. There'll be small numbers that reference these footnotes at the bottom and explain it there. And so look at the superscript, and then you go down to the footnotes, and that'll give you what the special requirement is. So moving on, specific use standards. We ended up moving a lot of these. Made a lot more sense to relocate these after the use table because you're already looking at all those uses, and then the specific use standards are just additional standards for specific uses. So accessory dwelling units, and a lot of these we ended up relocating from Chapter 12. So we have ADUs, accessory home occupation, child care facilities, drive-through facilities, educational services, gardens, large retail establishments, antenna tower, telecommunication facilities and temporary uses, and townhouses. Now, I will point out that educational services is one item that was previously within Chapter 6, and we did the off-street parking standards ordinance last year. And it was part of that section. We ended up taking it out because we knew we were going to follow this up with the use table ordinance, and it's being reinserted here. Nothing has changed within that language. A lot of this controls loading zone facilities and of these educational services. Yeah.
That's where I had a question, was in that section. Just trying to understand, because it talks about the zoning administrator. So who is the zoning administrator?
It's actually the community development director or designee.
Okay, that's good. And then I was wondering when you read that part, because people, that's the one that we've had so much talk about here. If someone wanted to complain, or I know that it talked about there's a written complaint process when they look at the educational services. I saw it in the document. Where do they go into the document to see the process? Because that was there.
I'm sorry,
To
complaint?
follow the process when they want to make a written complaint.
Of a zoning
Yeah.
complaint? Usually you file that with our office in writing. Could be, usually we would prefer it in writing, but it could be a verbal complaint. But usually the community development director or designee would handle.
Bill, you want to highlight that for Catherine, please, and everybody else?
So you're asking just the general process of any type of zoning complaint or
Yeah.
any zoning violation that would be reported to the office?
Yeah,
That
so-
generally falls, previously it was in Chapter 11 under administration. I'm sure it's moving forward to the section that Mike referenced. But it provides the process of how to file a complaint on an alleged zoning violation and the zoning administrator's responsibilities to respond to that.
Yeah, that's what I saw it in the thing. I guess I'm just trying to highlight that you put that into the document in a more clear way. So when people want to complain, it was in the document. It was easier than reading in the narrative. You took it out and you addressed it. It's one of the chapters.
I think we just ended up relocating it.
It's the
and
same
so-
language as the
Yeah,
code
it's the same language we
today.
have right now.
I think it's just more convenient to find it now.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so,
it's hard for Catherine to find it, so maybe we ought to talk a little bit about it.
Yeah.
Where is it then?
so is it chapter 11?
Usually it's administration and enforcement is where that was previously.
Yeah. The reason I'm asking is, as a representative, when people have complaints, I try to direct them to you all with the way of how to get to you all. And if it's already there, I can say, go here. That's what I'm trying to do.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it would usually fall within Chapter 11, zoning administrator responsibilities.
So it's just easier to give a call and find out the path.
Yeah, anytime you just direct them to our office and we could help, certainly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. The other item I'd like to point out here is drive-through facilities, and so those two are really the only changes we've seen here. Drive-through facilities, we haven't had any standards, I don't think ever, for drive-through facilities, and a lot of times you just deal with queuing. You know, everybody comes into town and looking at opening a drive-through facility, and always asks how many queuing spaces do I need to locate my my coffee shop or whatever it is. And we never have any portion of the code to point to, and so we've just codified that, established a queuing standard, a turning radius, things of that nature, and included that within the drive-through facility standards, so we have something to point to in order to handle those types of facilities. And then brings us to the limitations on use table. So this is, we had all these limitations on uses that were previously under each individual zoning district. We've broken those out into one table for all the zones, so they're not listed multiple times, under each zone. And then performance standards, that was just relocated from Chapter 6 into Chapter 3. And so this is what the limitations on uses table looks like. And so, for instance, all other uses than dwellings, no more than 35% of the lot area should be covered by buildings. A lot of those things that were underneath each zone, you can easily scroll across and see where it applies underneath what zoning district. And so nothing's changed here on the limitations on use section. We've just pretty much taken it from narrative form and put it into a table format. That brings us to Chapter 4, and this is the bulk and placement regulations chapter. And so this previously replaced special zoning districts where we had the University Zone and Legacy Crossing overlay. And so now we're just strictly talking about bulk and placement regulations. Give an introduction section, pretty much explaining the bulk and placement regulations, explaining the bulk and placement regulations table. So we previously had lot area, lot width, setbacks, open space, building height, all those things used to be listed underneath each zone. And now, like we've done with a lot of these things, broken them out into table format. And this is what that looks like. So once again, you have all the zones on the top, and then you scroll down. So we've got minimum lot requirements, which includes minimum lot area, minimum lot width, minimum setback requirements, exceptions to minimum setbacks listed above, and common open space requirements. So you're easily scrolls through depending upon what use it is. So if you're looking at a townhouse, looking at those requirements for lot width, you can easily scroll through to the zones where that use is allowed and easily find all of your bulk and placement regulations within that table. And so really makes it streamlined and easy for the user to be able to find this information. And then we have maximum building height, which rounds out the table. So once again, just scrolling over to any zone and looking at what the building height is for permitted structures as well as accessory structures on there. And then we have the superscripts with all the footnotes down at the bottom for all those intricate details. And then beyond this, we have exceptions to height regulations, and so nothing's changed there. It's just been relocated. We ended up creating a setback section. Some of those portions have been moved from Chapter 6, but a lot of this is new. So we have a definition of what constitutes a setback. So we had a definitions back in the definition section, but it was hard to find, and we thought we would just create this section, reiterate what a setback is, how you measure a setback in the setbacks measurements section. We've got permitted projections, so certain instances, if you have eaves, unwalled front porches, you're allowed to project into the required setbacks. We've just relocated this from Chapter 6. There's not a whole lot of changes here. Exceptions to required setbacks. This is one of those sections that was, I'd like to say, hidden in the definition section. I think that only staff, knew kind of the exceptions, and this pertains to a lot of anything that's really 30 inches or less in height. So you have a lot of decks that don't need to meet setback requirements because they're of a certain height, flat work or concrete. That was, really hidden in that definition section, and we thought we'd bring it out and put it underneath this section in order to have, all those special requirements for setbacks within this section. And then we've got our alternate front yard setback. There are really no changes here. This lets you average the two structures on either side of a structure in order to get an average front yard. Setbacks for flag lots, this was really just a historical interpretation of our department on how you measure setbacks for flag lots, and we wanted to codify it so it's just not a staff interpretation or policy and put it in the zoning code. And so we've got that explained there, as well as access to lots and buildings has just been relocated. And so what we do is follow this up with illustrations in order to measure setbacks. So for instance, how we measure our flag pole lots is to go to the center of the flag access, draw a radius for the front setback. And so, hard to explain in narrative format, but really easy when you put it in, an illustration and explain it there. And so a lot of our setbacks, if you're a local neighborhood street, you're not going to be measuring from the property line, you're going to be measuring from the back edge of the sidewalk in these circumstances here. And so it really just, conveys what the requirements are in an easy format so people can understand instead of just narrative. Brings us to Chapter 6, our supplementary regulations chapter. We go through, haven't done a whole lot here. A lot of things have ended up being relocated from this chapter to other chapters, and so that's what you'll see here. Exceptions to height regulations moved, accessories to lots and buildings, curb cuts. Curb cuts has been eliminated from this section, and it was previously, or it's currently within our engineering department. So they're the department that administers curb cut requirements, and so it's always been a little odd because we've had curb cut requirements in our zoning code, but yet community development's not the department that's administering these requirements. And they also have it in the street standards, and so if you were to change the streets, you'd have to change it in both sections in order to be able to implement a change. And so talking to Public Works, what we've gone ahead and done is just eliminated it from the zoning code, and they'll just retain it in their standard construction drawings and continue to administer the curb cuts for the city. Off-street parking requirements. So this is kind of the second phase. So we had the off-street parking ordinance last year, and we were holding off until we've got the use table with all of our clarified and new uses listed in order to be able to convert the parking table over to that. And so what you see here is pretty much the same use table. So you've got same format, all residential uses, all non-residential uses, and then you've got the parking requirements here. And so what we've simply done is just taken this format and all the updated uses and just applied what we previously had for the parking requirements. The comprehensive plan has directed us to go away from a lot of the requirements for parking which were based upon per employees. And so we've gone through and done that. We're looking at more of a static number where you have per square footage. And so with a lot of businesses, you see a fluctuation in employees. And so all of a sudden, they gain 5 employees and they're out of compliance with parking requirements. And it's hard for us to administer. So we've gone away from that and shifted a lot of those per employee calculations over to a per square footage calculation. And so that's one thing we've changed in the parking table. Rounding out Chapter 6, some more relocation here. So we've struck these sections. There is a slight amendment that we've wrapped into the use table ordinance for the sign code. Currently, we have, in some zoning districts, we've got caps on the number, the amount of signage that a property is allowed to have. And it really has become a challenge and a hindrance to some of the larger properties. So if you look at downtown, you could have a really small, narrow property on Main Street, has the same cap as, for instance, like Gritman's new medical office building, which is also in central business. And so what we've done in a lot of these districts is just eliminated that square footage cap and just let the amount of signage per sign type dictate what the maximum is. And so we have a cap on the amount of freestanding signs. So every freestanding sign has to, can't be over a certain size. Every wall sign is usually based upon the length of the wall that it's on. And so that's more of a sliding scale depending upon the size of the property, and it adequately allows those larger properties to have more signage, and so it slides with pretty much the size of and the the size of the building on the property as well. And so that's really the change that we've made and incorporated in the sign code.
Mike, that doesn't affect the dynamic sign size restrictions, does it?
It
At all?
doesn't.
Doesn't
no.
have any effect
no,
on that?
No, we didn't, yep, that section stays the same. Brings us to Chapter 11, Administration and Enforcement. So we're still, those sections about enforcement and complaints are still going to remain in Chapter 11. We do have a few sections that are being relocated to other areas, mainly the definition section. We want to get that to the very front of the zoning code so it's easy to find, and that's the big change here.
Your Honor, if I might, Mike, if you might flip back to that last slide. So that section 11-5, complaints regarding violations, Catherine, I think that was a question you had. It was previously 11-7, but with the two preceding sections above it, it just got renumbered, but it still stays in Chapter 11. But that is a section that talks about the process to report a suspected violation to the city.
Thank you.
Then Chapter 12, pretty much striking the whole chapter because we relocated a lot of the specific use standards into Chapter 2. And so Chapter 12 will pretty much go away. There was one thing I wanted to point out, and I had briefed Administrative Committee on this, was educational services. We did go back and look and review some of the NIACS sections that were underneath educational services, and it gives me a good example, good way to explain really the NIACS system. And so if you see educational services, that's the main sector is educational services, and then you have all these subsectors. And so, the nice thing about the NIACS system is you just list educational services, and all of these other uses are included within the NIACS system. And so you don't have to list those. They're just inherent that they're there. And so looking through a lot of the residential neighborhoods, so we were looking at ag forest through R3 zone, primarily residential. We were looking at the impact of some of these uses because previously we had separated elementary and secondary schools and colleges and universities. And so those were separate uses, and now they're combined underneath the sector educational services. And so, going back and really discussing that internally, we wanted to exclude colleges and universities from those areas that are primarily residential. And so we've gone through and put C19, so we've got a footnote that just allows elementary schools, secondary schools, and other schools in instruction only as defined by the NIACS numbers. And so looking at the list, we would just allow elementary, secondary schools, and then we have other technical and trade, other schools in instruction, so fine arts schools, sports and rec instruction, language schools, some of those things that may have less of an impact in a residential neighborhood. We wanted to specify but exclude the colleges and some of those larger institutions that may have a larger impact. And so that is one change that we've made since Planning and Zoning Commission had reviewed this.
Mike? What's the difference? Is there some significance to the different colors on all those, the blue and the purple there?
I had just taken a screenshot from online, and I had clicked on those, and so it was just the
Got it.
computer.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had a question on going through the definition page and trying to understand size of things. On item 77, it talks about 40,000 square feet, and you had so many examples, but I don't have an idea of what 40,000 square feet means. So I was wondering if, you know how you did the drawings for like setbacks and stuff? I thought that it would be helpful to have some sort of understanding. I don't have a comparison for 40,000 square feet. It's in that section about just item 77. It was just me just trying to understand that size of something. Do you have a size?
Well, an acre is about 43,560
Okay.
square feet, and so that is a good reference. But what's the 40,000?
It was just talking about, it's item 77, it's back up on the definition page, and it just talks about 40,000 square feet, and I just thought, I don't know what that means in terms of what, something that large, and I guess it had to do with, it you were starting to talk, it was in the very beginning. Yeah, I mean, I guess it was just large-scale retail, and I just didn't have any reference for 40,000 square feet.
Your Honor,
That's good.
if I might.
Bill?
Yeah.
Let's have Bill.
Like the old Tidymans building is just a little over 40,000 square feet in size,
Okay.
if that gives you a sense.
Yeah, totally. I
Yep.
just didn't have
We're
any.
slightly less than 1 acre.
That's good, thank you.
I think you're getting close to the end here, aren't you?
I
Mike?
am. I've got the last slide here, thankfully. So Planning and Zoning Commission did conduct a public hearing, and that happened April 11th, 2018, and they recommended approval. There was a slight modification to just some structuring, but nothing substantive. And staff's recommendation for you tonight is to conduct a public hearing and upon consideration of testimony presented, approve the ordinance under suspension of the rules requiring 3 complete and separate readings that can be read by title and published by summary. I'd certainly be able to answer any questions that you might have.
Mike, I got a question. You're talking about the April 11th Planning and Zoning meeting, the public hearing they had there. They had slight modification. You said it was about what now? Some,
It was just the
Modification.
structuring of really
Structuring.
the definition section. They didn't like the,
so was it wordsmithing of definitions then?
it was more arranging the bullet points, so they
Okay.
were correct grammatically.
Oh. Art,
Where did planned unit developments exist now?
PUDs would still exist within our PUD section, which is Chapter 5, I believe.
Okay, thanks. I didn't see those.
okay,
I have a question
Chapter
trying.
7, sorry.
Understanding, like, so we have the code, and then we have, so I went to the Moscow City Code to understand the central planning district, and it gives its definition, and then we have this table, and it has the same words? Yes.
Central Business District?
Yeah, but a definition of what the central business district is, or do you have to go back and then go back to the code?
What you do is, so it's not going to be in the use table, it's
Right.
in the purpose statements. And so I think we had intent statements right now, we're changing those to purpose. And so in Chapter 2, we have all the different zones still, and we have purpose statements for each zone.
Okay.
And so you would look up the zone and look at the purpose statement, and that really directs you to what the intent of the zone and where it's appropriately applied. You know, any other special nuances for that zone are included there, but it's really just a narrative description of the zone. And then for everything else, you would just look up the tables, because all of those things that previously were under there, permitted uses, conditional uses, lot size, lot width, limitations on uses, those have all been shifted out into table format. And so all you're left with is just that purpose statement, just describing the zone.
That's a great explanation, thank you.
other questions for Mike before I open up to the public hearing? Okay, thank you, Mike, and I will open up the public hearing right now at 7:38. And anybody like to speak in favor of this, please step forward. State your name. We'll give you 3 minutes to speak. Your name and your address. If anybody has general comments, I would take them at this time. If anybody has any comments, I'd take them at this time. Okay, well, going once, twice, and thrice, I'll close it at 7:39 and turn it over to council. So who'd like Art?
Well, I think it cleans things up a lot by having the tables instead of just trying to find what you need in the narrative section, which can be awfully ponderous and redundant and a bunch of other things that are deleterious to understanding. So I do like this new approach.
Catherine?
I just wanted to compliment you because I got to start with you on this process, and the comparatives that you brought forward to the commission to really help them see what they could do. I thought that was really beneficial for it to turn into such a complete, it's really dense how much you all did. So, excellent work. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Brandy?
I also want to compliment you and the entire Planning and Zoning Commission. I understand it was a long process and a lot of detail to work through, and it is very clear. So I think you've done a great job. If there aren't other questions, I would move to approve the ordinance with a change one change to the land use table to the central business district zone to no longer include educational services as a conditionally permitted use.
Second?
Yeah.
Okay, we got a motion by Brandy and a second by Ann to approve this ordinance table with the exception of, and do you want to state the page, the packet page number where you're talking about,
Sure.
Brandy, on the table you're
Yes, it's-
talking about, please?
Page 65 of the packet, the land use table, the central business district column, and educational services. So it would be to remove that as a conditionally permitted use.
Okay,
Bill?
further Bill?
Mike, could you bring up that page on the NICE classifications? I just want to make sure that the council's aware of everything that's included in that, because there are some other, like, commercial schools, so Mr. Leon's is in there, so that they would no longer be allowed. So I just want to make sure that the council is aware, because you could go through and identify, let's say, specific uses you didn't want to include, rather than just that entire category, so.
So
that
this
particular-
whole thing is in that
So,
category? is what you're
correct, so
saying, Bill.
everything, elementary, secondary schools, junior colleges, universities, business schools, computer management training, technical and trade schools, so that's where cosmetology and barber schools are within. And then you got the other schools and instructions like fine arts schools or sports and rec instruction. So I guess I just want to make sure that council understands, because of this complexity of the NIAX definitions, and if you look at the very highest class of the use, that would then essentially have a wide impact in that category. So just want to make sure you're aware of that, and if there may be specific uses on that list that you wanted to identify, then we could propose an amendment that would just address those uses.
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, I mean, that is an important thing to consider, and I think elementary and secondary schools, junior colleges, universities, and professional schools. I think I would probably also say business schools and computer management training. I mean, this is a whole much more detailed discussion, but I understand the need for that.
Yep.
Catherine?
I was just wondering in that too, so now that we have Gritman and Whammy
Mm-hmm.
is in there, so what are you thinking about that?
So they're already approved and they're there. All of the educational institutions that we currently have been approved and would stay. This is more moving forward. So in the first 116 years of our downtown district out of 128 years, their educational institutions were not permitted. So since before 2006, there were 0 students and 0 square footage occupied by educational institutions. Since 2006, when that zone changed, we now have about 41,000 square feet. So
Gives me a-
good question about tidyments. Or I was saying about 20 of your house, maybe. I don't know the size of your house, but, and have approved 540 students. About 220 are currently enrolled. So we already have built in an expansion, almost 2.5 times what we have today. So we have already approved quite a lot of growth in the student presence in our downtown. My reason for wanting to discuss this is that Moscow certainly benefits from the educational institutions and students, regardless of where they're located, as we know from the over 100-year history of the University of Idaho being located outside of the central business district. The central business district's original intent and purpose is really to be a center for business and commerce. And we have added quite a lot in a relatively short amount of time. And I think it's time to cap that growth, to protect the intent of that downtown to primarily serve as a business and commerce center for Moscow.
So, you know that I've been talking about this too, and I went to Bill and trying to understand, and we got the commission question on there. So, you and I have talked about this, and you and I have really kind of even disagreed with the interpretation of the question. And I was wondering, Jen, if you could bring that question forward, because that's where she and I really kind of had a larger conversation about removing one of the the educational institutions out of this table because of, remember when you did the presentation last week? Okay, and that one question that had to do with asking how people felt about educational institutions in the downtown business district.
And thank you. I can certainly pull that up. It'll take me just a minute, though.
Yeah, it's mostly just for reference because I'm not remembering, but I know that you
Yep.
and
Thank you.
And the reason that whole question came to be was because of that's why I went back to the code again, because of the central business district's definition. So,
While Jen's bringing that up, we'll have other conversation. Art, you want to put your take in on that?
I'll throw in 2 cents. I think this might be premature at this particular point in time. I think we should go ahead and complete the work on the table-based system that we're proposing here. Request back to planning and zoning to have another look at the educational institutions in the central business district to better refine the scope and intent, given the number of potential definitions there. I don't want to cut off one's nose to spite one's face on this and preclude where the educational institutions down there according to the NIACS table. So I think I wouldn't be in favor of doing the modification here on the fly. I'd be much more comfortable referring that one particular block in the table back to planning and zoning for further contemplation before we move forward with changing that one square.
Okay. Adam was the seconder, and would you like to speak, Ann, for a few minutes while we're waiting for this to come
Mike,
up?
if you could maybe tab down to the actual survey instrument so that the exact wording.
Yeah, I guess given the scope of the NIAC definition, I guess my question would be procedural, and that if we were to, I mean, would we then table it this evening until next time, or you're suggesting something else?
We got a motion and a second on the floor, and once we go through
Bill's got-
some conversation on it, we'll make a decision. But I'll go back. Bill, you got something you want to?
So the council has several options available to you. I mean, if you can craft an amendment that everybody can understand is fairly simplistic, that can be done tonight if the council so chooses to do so. If you'd like to see a change, be prepared and then have a chance to review it again. You could pass it on first reading with the direction to staff to provide that amendment and then have it come back to you to see the proposed change. I think what we're talking about, depending upon, I mean, we can decide, the council can decide what uses, if you wanted to make an amendment that you wanted to exclude. It's a simple footnote, and so it would be fairly easy to accomplish tonight to add a footnote 20, I think there's 19 to that table right now, and just put whatever description the council would like to have, excluding, the uses and the use code. Or if you'd like, again, you can pass it under first reading with that amendment, and then we can amend it, and you can have a second review at the next council meeting.
Jim?
I am kind of in agreement with Brandy about it's time for us to take a look at how much of the central business district is used for educational purposes. But I'm not sure, I think the issue is too complex for us to do it on tonight. And I don't think it really I think it's something that we should reconsider as an amendment, as a separate item for a future council meeting, as opposed to trying to do it on the fly because it's too complex for us to comprehend everything in terms of how this affects Mr. Leon's and every other little technical trade school thing that might go on or is already there. Or I feel like I don't understand the issue enough or enough about what's going on there, and I'd like to see that I think what the work that they've done as far as the tables and rearranging the code to make it way more understandable is great, and I'd want to move forward with that, but I want to consider this as a separate item where it's deeply considered and not done so in a short-term fashion.
You want to say something?
Yeah, I really do. I agree with Jim in that, again, with everybody, all of my cohorts up here, absolutely applaud your efforts and the amount of gargantuan work you did on getting this into what I believe is a more intuitive and a more user-friendly document that everybody can use. I think this topic, this specific moment, smells just a little bit too much like discrimination to me to get into this without further deep discussion. I will not be in favor of this tonight the way it's been presented, and I do think that we need deliberations far more than what we've had tonight.
I'm a little shocked to hear discussion of discrimination, but I'm not sure where that's coming from. I'm talking about our downtown being vulnerable to losing more tax-paying businesses to educational institutions. Doesn't matter whether they're University of Idaho, Boise State University, NSA, LCSE, some educational institution that we don't even know of because it doesn't exist yet. The largest businesses, those I think of currently housed by Champions, Moscow Hotel, the Food Co-op, NIAC, those are the ones that are the biggest risk of transitioning from a business to educational use in the future. And I think we have an obligation to realize that the way the zone is right now, Board of Adjustment is kind of stuck. So I think we need to be forward thinking about that. It has nothing to do with discriminating against anybody.
Okay, let's, Jen, we got this up because Catherine asked a question earlier. Let's get the what she asked, and then we'll move on further discussion here.
But so as question 17 in the commission survey, we sent this out last fall, and this was, as I understand, about a year into the use table discussions, with considerable amount of work to come after that as well. But this survey did ask, gave a brief overview of the allowance of public and private colleges under the conditional use permit in the central business district. And then said, given this process, do you agree that the educational uses should be allowed within the central business district through a conditional use permit? Highlighting exactly what the process is to date, and then asking the agreeance or disagreeance with that statement. 62% of the respondents did say that they are fine with educational uses under a conditional use permit, with 32% saying no. And this was a statistically valid response for the survey. It takes a good sample of our entire population, and within a 95% confidence interval.
Was that suffice what she was asking for?
Yeah, and that's, so, in talking with you about this particular topic, and trying to understand this when I've talked with administration, the point of the conditional use process is to make sure that we don't lose the purpose of the central business district. And it looks like that the citizens respect the process.
Right.
So,
Your Honor.
although
Hang on just a
well,
second.
but that's hard to figure out.
Correct. And
Bill.
I guess I didn't want to interrupt, but I just did want to clarify. Conditionally permitted uses are uses that have been deemed by the council as being compatible and allowable in that use, but because of their nature or their size or their operating characteristics, need individual review in order to determine whether any type of conditions need to be placed upon that use to mitigate any incompatible or mitigate any impacts of that use. So they're generally deemed to be permissible uses. It's just that CUP allows for an opportunity because of, again, the size, the nature, the scale of that use, that there may be conditions that need to be imposed in order to ensure that it's compatible with other uses downtown. So it's not to maintain the integrity of the central business district as a commercial use because it's already been deemed as being an allowable use there.
Exactly.
It's just to allow that review to say, no, there needs to be some conditions. You need to provide, in this case, oftentimes been parking to mitigate your impact on parking. But it's generally deemed as being an allowable use in that district. It just needs individual review to make sure that something does not need to be mitigated. So that was the only clarification was it's not to preserve the integrity of a zoning district. It is just to make sure that because of that use, and there's a number of them that are in the central business district that need to be reviewed on an individual basis.
Gary, did you have?
And correct me if I'm wrong, there may be applications that may be denied because they cannot be conditioned to be compatible. Is
Correct.
that
There,
not
there are
correct?
specific criteria for approving, and if the impact is unmitigable, and then that may be a basis of denial. And, to the where the impacts are so significant, there are no conditions that can be imposed to mitigate the impacts, that it'd be just detrimental in that location. That'd be somewhat rare, because in theory, the council and the Planning and Zoning Commission have already reviewed these uses and deemed them to be generally compatible. It's just that some may need individual review because of their operating characteristics.
So meaning that the Board of Adjustment can't decide at a certain point, this is going to change the character of our downtown, and we have enough.
Correct.
They can't do that with this in the zone.
Correct. The council has already spoken in the code that this is a use that the council has deemed to be appropriate in that location, and it becomes very difficult then for the board to deny it. A case has to be made that there's no way to mitigate the impacts of that use, therefore the only choice is deny it. And that's kind of a high bar typically. So I just wanted to make that clarification.
Okay.
I want to say that I appreciate the work that went into the question, but I don't find it to be very telling. And that I think it sort of speaks to the idea that either you do or don't have conditional uses down there or permits down there, because it doesn't talk about additional conditional use permits. And so when framed that way, I see it as, do you or do you not support what already exists, as opposed to the expansion of, which is what I would like this conversation to be, which is if we're sort of capping that growth and that idea.
And another thing about the question, I also appreciate the attempts with survey questions. Like, we found out many times it's not until after that you realize, oh, I wonder if everyone was interpreting this the same way and what these results mean. So, and this is a conversation I've had with you, because this could be read as, do you approve of them through a conditional use permit versus a regularly permitted use? And we don't know if the people that said yes are saying yes, conditional use permit versus nothing, or if they're saying conditional use versus regular permitted use. So there are still some unknowns, and I hesitate to read too much into the results of that one question, because I think it can be interpreted in the way that Ann said, additional versus existing, and also conditional use permit versus regularly permitted use versus no permit.
And well, that goes with anything else. I think each one of us could interpret however we wish to interpret it from our own meaning and our own definition. I think as human beings, that's what we do naturally.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's why we run into issues. Because we do run into things that are different, and we interpret them different. So,
Yeah.
Well, I tell you, folks, we do have a motion and a second. The motion is to approve of the ordinance with the exception of educational services downtown conditional use permit. And it was
Did Catherine
made
want-
by Brandy, and it was seconded by Ann. And so eventually, we're going to vote on this motion, and then we're going to move on to more conversation, depending on what happens with this
Well, I was
motion.
just wondering, how do we, since we're talking about this and going with Art said, to amend it to take more time with this particular area?
Well, we can go
have to-
through this process, and then, depending on whatever happens with this motion, then we can make a decision on that. Or you guys can make a decision on that, okay?
Wait,
Sound
Your
good
Honor,
enough?
Can I add one more thing? I do really appreciate, thank you, Bill, for pointing out the complexities of all of the institutions that would be affected by taking that off. And I appreciate hearing your comments too, that, more time needs to be taken to consider the difference between all these different educational institutions, instead of a blanket. I appreciated hearing that input, so, thank you.
Well, okay. Does everybody understand the motion in a second?
Can I get clarification on that?
You want to read it back? Judy, have you got it?
I didn't catch all of it.
Okay. The motion that Brandy put was to approve the ordinance with the exception of the educational services downtown with a conditional use permit going forward, that they wouldn't be able to have it. Seconded by Ann.
Your Honor,
Is that correct? Yes.
if I might have Mike just bring it to the table so we can just kind of demonstrate what that would look like, just so you clearly understand the motion.
It's on packet 65, you said, I don't know, remember, is underneath of public and institutional uses.
So the central business column at the top, as you carry down to educational services, it would just go blank in that square.
Yeah,
And that was just denote not as permitted or as conditionally permitted.
yeah. That's what the motion was, wasn't it, Brandy?
Right, yes.
Yeah,
that
I
w-
just
that
wanna
was
make
the
sure-
motion, yeah.
And that's what you approved the second.
And so just to clarify, to sort of moving forward, if this is kept the way it is, we will have a discussion about how to go further in depth at a future time, maybe involving planning and zoning or whatever we decide. Or if it was taken off, we could have that same discussion about if we could add specific things back in. Is that? That's okay.
I'm sorry,
I
Gary
can
had my
say-
attention there
okay.
momentarily.
Okay, that's okay.
Well, once this, Brandy, if the motion passes as is, the ordinance will go through just like it
Right.
is, with that being scrubbed, just like Bill said. Further discussion would happen down the road sometime with somebody, but it wouldn't necessarily happen now based on what this motion is. It would kill that educational service downtown with a conditional use permit. You want something?
Yes, please. Also, you do have pre-existing educational uses downtown. They would all become pre-existing non-conforming uses. If destroyed, they would not be allowed to be rebuilt. They would not be able to expand. So just want to make sure the council
Yep, that's
understands
correct.
the effect on the existing
current ones
uses.
that are there now.
that are
Right, so if an
downtown now.
existing educational use closed, it could not be reopened as another one.
Jim?
I, correct me if I'm wrong, Brandy, but I think the intent of your motion is for us to consider the effect of educational institutions in the central business district going
Yeah.
forward.
Right,
And-
moving forward.
And so
Additional.
we could, whatever happens to this motion, we could still, you could make another motion that we do something that it goes to planning and zoning for reconsideration in terms of what we should do with that particular piece in the future. I understand that if it passed as you made the motion, then it would kind of force the issue, that people that want that will be active in trying to bring it back in some fashion. Whereas if it's, if we vote it down, we need to do something proactive to make sure that it comes to light, that the issue is studied in more depth.
I would
That makes
support
sense.
that.
Okay, so,
One point of clarification, I think I was wrong in understanding nonconformity then. So if it's nonconforming and, as you said, if it was destroyed, so that's, you're not able to rebuild then?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
We had recently changed that so you could rebuild. If they were legal, non-conforming uses and
Well,
it's
that-
destroyed by more of a natural disaster, we had just changed that recently within the last couple of years, and so that was a change.
As long as
So-
it didn't include expansion.
Correct.
Correct.
So a fire could be,
Look at the zoning administrator.
Correct. A non-conforming, so you can continue non-conforming use. And so really the destruction oftentimes in the code refers to destruction of a non-conforming structure. It doesn't meet setbacks, it's too tall or whatever it might be. Or it's a non-conforming use in that zoning district. So we have a lot of residential areas where residential was allowed, single family through multifamily. So we've got a number of it up through Fort Russell. And if one of those structures were destroyed, previously, it could not be rebuilt, and we did modify that to allow for those non-conforming structures to be rebuilt and the associated use. If we had a situation and we had Mr. Leon's or some other type of non-conforming, or what would become a legal non-conforming use in a structure downtown that couldn't expand, so they'd have to stay in their existing footprint, and they probably couldn't grow, maybe necessarily enrollment to some degree. So that would have to be a question of the scale and growth of the use. Usually, it's when it becomes a non-conforming use, it's kind of at that same size and scale. But if it was burned down and they were temporarily just closed to restore or to do repair, we wouldn't extinguish the use. If they voluntarily discontinued the use, and the way the code reads is more than 6 months, then they would lose that use. Correct. And it could not be reestablished at that point.
so it's not really any different than, because as it is currently, an expansion would require going through the conditional permit
Correct, yeah, if, it just, they couldn't, let's say,
But we would just
move
be
into
getting
the
rid of
space
that,
next
so they
door
couldn't-
to grow
right.
their business, they would not be able to do that, correct,
So it just limits additional, which is
correct.
what I'm concerned about.
And my last little pitch here is just with all those different classifications, and there are some like business training, computer training, and others, that I don't know the extent of what occurs downtown upstairs, but, you know, offices. And so, you know, something that's a little bit more focused would be my preference rather than that entire classification.
Right.
Yeah, I understand the concern, the immediate concern, but I'm concerned of unintended consequences
Right.
from some of the others. And that's just, I just wanted to voice that before the
Right.
council made a
Makes
vote on the
sense.
motion.
Can we look at that table one more time? I'm sorry, not, yeah, I think,
The list of.
Then I-
yes, please,
yes.
thank you.
So, Mr. Mayor, can I get some questions answered by Bill? Hey, Bill,
Call for the question.
what about,
Yeah.
is a yoga class considered educational?
Sure, if they're teaching.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, sports and recreation instruction, that could be. So if it were me, and if that was the intent of the council, as I understand the intent, is I would limit it to a footnote that say excluding 6111, 6112, and 6113. That would do the elementary, secondary, junior colleges, and colleges and universities. If that was the council's intent, that'd be my preference, because then we're not getting into business schools, computer management training, technical trade schools, and others that I think, you know, could be happening in the downtown area. Those three, I think, would cover, and right now, I don't think elementary and secondary is actually even allowed in central business. Not that it'd be a really suitable location or desirable for that use. But I think those three categories would probably then leave the more commercial activities happening below that. But that's just,
Right, which tend to be businesses and for-profit and more in line with the intent of the
Can we call
central
for
business district.
How do I do that?
Call for the question.
Call for the question, please.
Okay, well, call for the question is the discussion ceases because everybody's had a chance to have a point of view and we vote. And however the vote turns out, it doesn't mean if the vote is voted down, then we'll continue with some more deliberation. And so we'll go from there and I'll start to roll with Ann.
Aye.
Nope.
Aye.
No.
Aye.
So we got 3-3? Is
Yep.
that correct? The mayor votes no, so the motion is killed and we will resume conversations. Jim, I'm going to leave it with you.
Okay, so at this juncture, I guess I would move to approve the ordinance as presented for the time being, because I feel like we're somewhat protected in the short term by the conditional use provisions, and that this is very complex and it needs further
I would agree with that.
further study to make a reasoned decision on it. So that's what I'm moving, that we approve the ordinance as presented without three complete and separate readings and on
Second,
that.
Who seconded?
Ann?
Ann did? Okay.
Your Honor.
Yes, Brandy, now we can get back in
Okay.
discussions again, so.
I'm going to try one amended motion to accept the ordinance with the exception of the central business zone to not include 6111, 6112, and 6113
Is that,
as conditionally
you're
permitted
making a
uses.
motion to amend
Yes.
Jim's motion,
Yes.
which requires a second?
Yep.
Second.
Okay. Brandy, would you state those numbers you said again up there? 611 what?
6111,
Okay.
6112,
Okay,
and 6113.
okay, so we've got a motion by Jim and a second by Ann to approve the ordinance such as it is with the suspension and requiring 3 complete readings. And we have an amendment that was by Brandy to accept that with the exception of eliminating 611, 61111, 61112, 61113, and that was seconded by Catherine. So We actually have to vote on two things, if I got it right?
I think it's just 6113.
It's just
process-
112.
The process is that you have a motion with the second on the floor being discussed. A motion to amendment has been made, it's been seconded. Now you discuss the amendment to determine whether the majority of the council wants to include the amendment in, whether the original motion is amended. I would ask that you restate your motion, though.
Okay,
You're not, with some,
yes,
Yeah,
I will,
because-
yep,
I think you need to clarify it, that I'm assuming you're referring to only the central business district
yes.
in that exclusion? Then that needs to be
Right.
stated in your
So
motion.
approve the ordinance with a change to the central business district zone to no longer allow educational services as a conditionally permitted use with the exception, oh, no, I'm sorry. To not allow, go ahead, Bill.
If I may
help me.
assist?
Yes, you may.
Would be to add a footnote 20
Okay,
within the central business district educational services use, excluding specifically uses 6111, 6112, and 6113. So all that would happen is a footnote would be added. It still shows being conditionally permitted with a new footnote 20
okay.
that would say excluding those three uses.
And that was, again, 61111, 61112, 61113. Am I correct on that?
I think you have an extra one in there.
Just
On all of them?
Yeah.
correct.
Okay, so it is 6111, 6112, 6113.
Correct.
Art.
I'm with Jim on this one. I think there are too many nuances for consideration tonight. I would like to see it go as is and then go back to planning and zoning for further consideration. P and Z does a good job of considering many facets, many nuances of these, and I think that it needs to go back at least to that far and be reconsidered. So I would be against the amendment of the motion on the table.
Okay.
I agree with Art. It didn't get any less complicated. The motion just got less complicated,
Okay.
so.
Jim?
Well, I think what Brandy's proposing there is kind of gets to the heart of the issue, that what she wants to take out are things that basically take things off the tax rolls. And that's part of the piece there, that we're losing tax revenue if non-taxable entities are allowed to take over profit-making businesses that contribute to the tax base. And that's part, but it's not clear to me that those are the only ones
Right.
in that, in all of those uses. And I'd like to see that studied in more depth. And so I'm going to have to come down with Art and say.
And okay, and vote against the motion. Okay. Other discussion,
My other
Catherine?
discussion is too, because the same thing is not completely understanding it, but I worry that if we don't accept it, that us trying to discuss this is, and I appreciate what you're saying, Art and Jim, but I think by actually making a statement about it, we will force the issue of planning and zoning.
Well, it does force it. That's.
Well, we kind of force it by sending back to planning and zoning for further study.
And we could do that with a separate motion. We could vote as a council to send this particular issue back for further study. Direct staff to take it and study it further. So it doesn't just go out into the ether and get lost. We can force the issue for further consideration. That's what I'd like to see.
Well, yes, and I think that's my concern, is that I just don't want it, and I think you're trying to make sure, I don't want it to eviscerate, and that's why you're making the motion, so we deal with it. So I would like to have staff give us much more information on this.
Okay, well, we still have a motion. It was by Jim and seconded by Ann, and then an amendment to that motion by Brandy and Catherine that is attached to that.
So, Your Honor, I would call the question on the amendment
Okay.
first, and then
Okay.
let's vote on
Yeah.
that.
Okay? We can do that. That's legal, correct? Okay, so the question was called on the amendment only, not the motion
Correct.
Jim and Ann made, the one that Brandy and Catherine made, and I'll start to roll with Ann.
Nay.
No.
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 Aye.
Okay. Okay, so the amendment is dead, and now it goes back to the original motion was to approve, I gotta read this. To approve the ordinance and the suspension of the rules requiring 3 complete and separate readings. And it'll be read and titled by published by summary. correct, Jim?
That's correct.
And I will start to roll with Brandy.
No.
Yes.
Yes.
Aye.
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 Okay, so that one passes. So this ordinance, in fact, did pass 5-1. And I will read this ordinance number 2018 dash something.
12.
10 and 12.
Where are
We'll
we?
find the number.
Okay,
Yeah.
anyway, I'll repeat the number, I'll read the ordinance and tell you what the number is. An ordinance of the City of Moscow, Idaho, a municipal corporation of the State of Idaho, providing for the amendment of Moscow City Code Title 4, Chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 11, and 12, providing for the conversion of the portions of the zoning code from the narrative to table format, providing for the restructuring of certain chapters within the zoning code, providing for the conversion of commercial use definitions to the North American Industry Classification System, providing for the amendment of the sign regulations to accommodate larger properties, providing for the insertion of drive-through facilities within the specific use standards, providing for the insertion of illustrations to better convey requirements, providing that the provisions of this ordinance be deemed severable, and providing for this ordinance to be in full force and effect from the date of its passage, approved, and publication according to law. Gary, have we got a number yet?
Your Honor, we do not.
Okay,
We
we-
can, if you direct us, with the city clerk being at training in Virginia.
Okay.
We will go find that number and we will insert it with the council's discretion.
Okay, now we want to have a little bit further discussion, so we're not moving on, so.
Well, Mike, great job with it. The table is awesome, by the way, and all of planning and zoning.
Art,
I'd like to, with the concurrence of council, request that we remand that one block of educational institutions in the Central Business District be remanded to planning and zoning for further examination for the nuances of the code to study whether educational institutions are indeed compatible with the purpose and intent of the Central Business District, and bring back a recommendation to council for the modification of the ordinance that we just passed.
just that one thing.
Yep.
Second.
Just that one
Well,
thing.
this doesn't need a motion, we'll give staff direction.
Distraction?
Right.
Just wanted to look at the wording there. So we're not remanding it, but you're going to request the commission explore that topic, and you're requesting that they bring you an amendment, which we don't know if that's going to be their recommendation or not.
Okay, that could be.
The commission did have discussion about this during this process and openly said they felt it was currently compatible with existing uses downtown. And so I'm just always, when we bring these questions back to the commissions, when they've worked through this process, is trying to understand what are we asking them to look at. Do you want them to hold additional public input sessions to garner that? I mean, that's the thing of the question is they've talked about this through this process. They came to a conclusion in what they forwarded to you, and now you're asking them to take a look at it. And I really would like to have as specific instruction as we can about, what about, that use do you wish them to look at? Tax status is a difficult one. We have a lot of tax exempt uses that are allowed downtown, churches, governmental offices, and other uses. So that's one that we generally can't regulate. They're nonprofits. Gritman Medical Center is a nonprofit and is tax exempt. So I'd like to, I guess, better understand what it is that the council would like them to discuss, if you may.
Jim?
I guess I would, in order to condense that down, say, I think we'd all like more information on the various possible consequences of limiting the square footage of educational institutions in the Central Business District. What are the pros and cons of that action? That's what I'd like to know. And I think other people have.
Does that go along with you, Art?
Pretty much, but I think the point that I see as being the real sticking point is that under conditionally permitting there, it mentions the words cumulative impact.
Not any longer.
That went away?
Correct.
I didn't see that. So does it give any indication at all?
Just a standard criteria for every conditional use. So the same standard 7 criteria would apply.
So I'm going to go to Ann next. Ann had her hand up, and then I'll come back to you, Brandy.
Oh, yeah. So Jim and a couple of people have mentioned sort of what the consequences of that would be. Are we talking about an inventory then of what already exists? Is that sort of what you're getting at? No?
No, but where it would go in the future, for instance, if it was to double, if that was, how would that look in terms of our central business district? And if the amount of educational square footage doubled in the central business district, what does that do to our central business district?
Yeah, and I would say it already has more than doubled since it was the first approved use. It's already more than double that in these last few years. So that would, I mean, this pace is concerning, and at some point do we need to cap that? But I think if getting public input about this topic, including giving the background, having the background of, the number of students that there were and the amount of square footage up until 2006, and just the little timeline of what has happened since then to give everyone a sense of that. I think making sure that it's understood that the amount enrolled right now, we already have built in 2.5 times more than that, than what we have today, and trying to sort of envision that and discuss that and have public input about, is that what is desired for downtown, more beyond that? So I don't know the best way to have public input, but these two are raising their hands down there.
Let me go with Catherine next, and then I'll go back. You wanted something.
So for Bill, it's, for me, in the conversation that I brought up like a year and a half ago, it has to do with the question. And the question for the conditional use, getting that 62% that people said, and the wording of it has something like negative impacts, like, do we use the conditional use process to negate, which is wrong, the negative impacts? And so, to me, the public input helps us see what the negative impacts are that we might not be seeing, or the Board of Adjustment might not be seeing in part of that conversation. So that's what I'm interested in. And to me, the fact that the percentage given shows that people like the conditional use process because it allows them to talk about what the negative impacts are. That's what I want to know, because I don't know those.
I don't understand.
Art?
How about this, just asking planning and zoning to have a look at the NIAX table there and determine which uses they think might be incompatible with central business versus which uses they think should be incorporated into the central business as a conditional use.
But they've
Which was
already
the
done
ordinance
that.
you saw tonight.
Yeah.
Right, we already had that. Already had
We're
that.
asking them for
sorry.
more information and more reflection on that, to take a look at the, as you put it, the unintended consequences of taking an action right here tonight.
I think that'll,
I
Well,
would
you
love
have an
to-
ordinance that is passed, and so this ordinance is passed, and it's bylaw as soon as it gets published, but this is a discussion for planning and zoning to have in the future. They don't need to have a public hearing on it that I know of, unless it changes the whole ordinance. If the system of the ordinance changes, then it'd be a new public hearing. Wouldn't that be correct?
they can do public input sessions in a number of different ways. It doesn't necessarily need to be a hearing.
Okay.
Or they could potentially also engage and do a more detailed survey of the community if there's concerns. Really, the best way to get somewhat of an objective opinion of the general populace is that survey, and maybe more detailed questions could be asked that address the ambiguity of the single question that was allowed in the commission survey, to try to understand, would they support it as a permitted use by right, or is a conditional use permit, or the expanded, or the new question of what currently exists? I mean, if you truly wanted to get the public's opinion and not just mobilize sides either for and against, which is exactly what's going to happen to the commission, is to get that somewhat more independent survey with questions that are more broad than what was just in the single question. There is a cost involved in that. It'll be several $1,000s to do that survey because of the postage that's involved. And so that will be, Gary probably knows more directly the cost of doing that work. But I know it's going to be to the tune of
Gary, you wanted?
$3,000 to $5,000.
$3,000 to $5,000.
I think, ultimately, I think when Bill said that Planning and Zoning Commission, council has made the determination that educational uses in the downtown are allowed if they can be conditioned. So planning and zoning is not going to they're not going to override the council's decision. So ultimately, I think the decision is in the council. Sending it back to P and Z to have them take further input is merely delaying the inevitable, and that is the vote of the council on whether they are allowed uses that can be conditioned. If the council finds that they are not allowed uses that can be conditioned, then the council needs to vote them off. Council did that tonight, and when the motion came up to exclude them, council voted it down. So that's the council's directive thus far. Secondly, the council said, okay, we'll pass it under suspension, and that was done as well. So with the proviso, you'd like some more work on it. My question is, and I think Bill's conundrum is, what are you asking P and Z to do? When ultimately the council is going to be the one to say yes or no. And the most recent action by this council was done about 5 minutes ago.
Yeah, that's correct. Brandy?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think planning and zoning, they've done their job already with this particular issue. So it sounds like there's a lot of interest in exploring this further, looking at all those lots of educational codes and making a decision, but not so quickly. And that's why we pass this as it is, with the understanding that we're going to look into this in more depth. I don't think planning and zoning is going to come back with anything differently, because they've already done this. But, you know, I would want to hear from the business community. You know, I think there can be, I like the idea of surveys, and specifically some that are targeted to that downtown, just the same way you have, you know, notice for surrounding property owners when something is going to happen there. Get specifically target the business as well as the general citizenry. And really, I think it's important to include in those surveys a little bit of the background so people understand, are fully aware of the pace that this has been going.
Well, Brandy, the point that I want to make to you, under the conditional use permit process, businesses have got a chance to speak, just like any other human being. If it is bothersome to them, they can come right forward and say it. That's
Yep,
what
and I
public
do know there are
hearings
many businesses that would like to speak about that did not before, and there's
Well,
some.
then look at, we can't guess, and we're not mind readers of what people will or will not do. And I mean,
Yeah, no, I know that.
It
That's,
is,
I mean,
and
if we
so-
want to know, we can still provide a venue to hear it.
yeah.
If-
well,
if we
will.
say it's
Under-
too late, then we don't need
Under
to.
the conditional use permit, it will be heard.
Right.
It will be heard, no matter what. And if you got businesses that don't have the guts to come up and stand for what they think is right, then they're gonna have to live with what happens. And the buck stops right here at the council. And you've done your best job.
Yeah,
okay?
I just-
So those businesses out there that complain to you, for crying out loud, you can tell them, look, I gave my best shot.
Right, I know,
So
I
you
still.
guys need to jump on the
That's true, I
fence and
still
come to
want
these
everybody to hear
meetings.
what they have to say about this moving forward, you know?
So,
Not on a case-by-case basis, but.
okay, well, I'm gonna tell you what, folks, we're moving on to item number 6, which is,
Your Honor, if I may, I'm sorry. Were we given directive then to engage planning and
No.
zoning?
No.
We are not at this point.
no.
Okay.
So is nothing happening then?
Well, I don't think nothing's happening. I think we want more information on what are the unintended consequences of all these various types of educational institutions leaving or coming into the central business district, and how can we mitigate any sort of harm that might
If I
occur
may,
there?
perhaps what we can do then, if you will kick it back to staff, we can work with Mike and Bill and try to determine what information can be developed to engage the administrative committee, and then we can glean further direction from that. Would that be
Yeah, I think
appropriate?
that's a great starting place.
Okay, that's where we'll start. Agreed,
I
okay.
just don't want it to die.
Sure, understand.
Okay, we will move on to item number 6, which is the FMPP grant application. Jen Piffner will present. Good evening, Jen.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Thank you so much. I am here to request ratification of a submitted grant application for the Farmers Market Promotion Program. This was submitted several weeks ago, given the deadline, and as a application for a federally administered USDA grant. The farmers market proposed 2 projects within that grant application that dovetail quite nicely, one of which came directly from the farmers market strategic plan, which was over a year in the making and discussed at length by the Farmers Market Commission, to include a market layout review, basically looking at the safety, looking at the restrictive issues that we have with the market and the limit on growth that we have for the market at this time. Coupled with that, we've also proposed a project to identify a branding concept for the farmers market, knowing full well that the Moscow Farmers Market is a very unique and special thing that Moscow has, and in doing anything to a layout and looking at any recommendations, we want to be sure that we keep in mind that brand concept and we maintain the market integrity. So kind of a twofold project to make sure anything we may or may not research or look into with the layout would move forward appropriately. This also ties in a bit to expansion of the market in that we've had requests to expand the market, but if we do so, we want to make sure that we do it thoughtfully and to, again, maintain that market integrity. So with this assistance from this grant, it's not to exceed about $135,000 for both projects, and would greatly appreciate the outside help, a consultant's professional help on this, as it's not a topic that branding we've done a bit of, but the layout and expansion of a farmer's market we have not delved into very often, so want to make sure we're doing it appropriately.
Ann, any question?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, I'm just curious if you've had discussions yet about what you want that branding process to look like.
We've looked a little bit at the Moscow Chamber of Commerce's process, knowing full well that that had several components, with several partners that came into that. And we're happy to participate in that, looking at some public input. We've got a great batch of market customers that we can pick their brains from every year, so look forward to getting about 5,000 opinions, give or take. And then also looking with our vendors and saying, okay, how can this benefit you as a vendor? How we're really trying to get our producers and our consumers linked up so that our producers are seeing an increase in sales, the market's seeing more traffic. And this all ties back into our economic impact study that shows how that benefits Moscow as a whole. So several layers of partnerships there that we'd like to address, but using that chamber model for pursuing this with several different audiences and customers in mind.
Great. And so will this go to RFP then, whoever we select?
Yeah, we'd have 2 different RFPs or RFQs, depending on the process, and then that would be one for the branding and one for the layout consultant.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Any questions for Jen?
I think this is exciting, and I would move that we approve ratification of submittal of the grant request for the 2018 Farmers Market Promotion Program with a total project cost estimated not to exceed $135,000, with no local match required.
Yes, sorry.
Second.
Thanks, Art.
Okay, we've got a motion by Gina and a second by Catherine to approve the ratification of submittal of grant request for the 2018 Farmers Market Promotion Program with the total project cost estimated not to exceed $135,000 with no local match required. Further question before I take a roll? Start with Brandy.
Aye.
All right.
Aye.
Aye.
All right.
Aye.
Okay, thank you, Jen, very much. We will move on to item number 7, which is Internet Crimes Against Children. Memorandum of Understanding. Chief James Fry. Hello, Chief.
How are you tonight?
Good.
Honorable Mayor and Council, thank you for allowing me to present this opportunity for the City of Moscow and the Moscow Police Department. We have been asked by the Idaho Attorney General's office to have Detective Eric Chernus be a part of their task force. And through the MOU, we would, the Attorney General's office and the state would actually pay for the salary and benefits through state funds, and then any overtime is paid through a grant that they've received. We would also receive computer supplies, software, and any additional training that he would go to at that time that would be paid for by the state. This would allow us to begin a succession planning where we can bring in a second Internet Crimes Against Children investigator. And as you know, through I think over the years you've watched, this is a highly skilled position. This isn't something that we can just bring anybody into. So it gives us an opportunity for the second detective to train under Eric Chernus. Eric Chernus is probably one of the best in the Northwest, and we're lucky enough to have him. As part of the strategic plan of 2015 for the police department, part of that plan was for us to keep up with the ever-changing demands of forensic and electronic investigations. In 2012, we saw 22 forensic examinations. In 2013, we had 81 forensic examinations. In 2014, we had 61. And virtually every investigation we do now involves some form of forensics with a cell phone, computers, gaming systems. Everything is tied to computer forensics. We hired Eric 2 years ago, and he's already completed 129 forensic investigations. Some of those, as you well know, have been some of the child porn and very heinous crimes. We're very lucky to have an individual like Eric. The Department of Justice actually recognized him in 2017 for the investigations and charging of 15 criminal child pornography cases. And he just got back from the National Computer Forensic Institute in Alabama. It's a very highly competitive process to go to a 5-week training. He just got back from that. He had to have the Secret Service actually had to nominate him for that. And he brought back about $40,000 worth of equipment as well with that. So what we're asking is that you would allow us to sign the MOU so that we can get him on this task force and we can start bringing another one in to follow up with that.
Thank you, Chief. The neat thing about this, it's not neat that we have to have this sort of thing in our society, but we have to have it, is we get recognition, not only national recognition, but it's a big deal for us here in Moscow, Idaho, for being within the state of Idaho. It's something that we're recognized throughout. We help other jurisdictions in both, surrounding states with helping solve some of these heinous crimes, like the chief said. Gary, you had a point you wanted to make?
Thank you, Your Honor. Legal and administration have reviewed the contract as well, met with the representative from the Idaho Attorney General's office. The city will be reimbursed for Detective Jernus's actual expenses, training, equipment. For the only time we will not be reimbursed is if he's working on non-cyber crime. So if he's out collecting evidence at some crime that's not related to his work in computers, then we would not be reimbursed for that. So the contract allows us to terminate it at any time. So we can, if it doesn't work out, we can come back. What this does, however, is it does allow us to expand, as the chief indicated, into an additional cyber detective. It's a little bit problematic. Typically in budget situations, you want to try and have as stable a budget situations as you can. Because this is one of those things the city can withdraw from, we have to be very circumspect about that. Also wanted to make sure, the chief mentioned that this the position, Eric will continue to be an hour employee, continue to do what he's doing today. It will, in recovering those funds from the Attorney General's office, it does give us capacity to hire that second cyber detective, not only for internet crimes against children. That is one of the facets of what Eric does and any new position would do, but that position is not specific. The MPD position is not specific for that. Certainly it takes a lot of time. Spends a lot of time on that sort of crime. But that isn't the only crime that this detective would be working
Well, cybercrime is more than just the sickos out there that
Exactly.
are preying on kids. It's a bunch of other kooks. So this is great because we could get another officer that could help with that. That's a big deal for us.
I move to approve the memorandum of understanding with the Idaho Attorney General's office.
Seconded.
Okay. We have a motion by Art and a motion by Catherine and a second by Art to approve the memorandum of understanding with Idaho Attorney General's office. We'll start to roll with Ann.
Aye.
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 Thank you. There you go, Chief. Thank you, sir.
Have a good night.
You as well. Okay, item number 8, medical insurance proposal and direction. Gary Riedner will present and introduce this.
Thank you, Your Honor. See if I can remember how to work this. Okay, thank you. I'm happy to introduce Chad Murray, who's president of the Murray Group, and Ellie Armstrong, who's a VP in their organization who works directly with the city of Moscow. Murray Group is our health benefits consultant. They have been with us for about 11 years. They've been working with us on our various employee benefits, as well as, most notably, our health insurance, which, as you know, we negotiate. It's currently provided by Regents Blue Shield. They have been our health insurance provider since about 1996. And over that period of time, since we've run statistics since 2006, we average somewhere around 5.5% annual increases in health insurance premium. Some of that is occasioned by the new Health Care Act that was passed under the Obama administration and some of the reporting insurance requirements that came with that. So we've seen fluctuations. Some years we've had as low as 0% increase. Some years we've had as high as 11%. The factors, as you know, that impact health insurance premiums are the general state of health insurance, inflation, regulation that causes additional money that needs to be paid, and the experience of our groups. So the more that we utilize our health insurance, the more experience it is, less money for the insurance company because they're paying more in claims out. And then in a typical lagging pattern, your experience from the previous year will impact the premiums you pay the following year. So Chad will explain the nuances of that. One of the things that we've been looking at for several years as we look to tackle the employee benefits and especially medical insurance situation is how do you continue to provide competitive, compassionate employee benefits to our employees so that they can take care of their families and themselves. We can remain competitive in the marketplace as we compete for employees. But how do we do that in a manner that allows us to be able to fund it? How do we make that a sustainable program? So we've looked at some different options for that. We've had an employee benefits group that has been looking at this for about the last 15 months. Under former Human Resources Director Mark Brigham. There are a lot of issues that were discussed, everything from conventional insurance as we have, adjusting that by increasing deductibles. We have a very competitive, very good deductible at this point, which we've indicated does need to be adjusted upward so that it becomes more sustainable for us. Also looked at some HSAs. We have a current VIBA program, Voluntary Employee Benefit Account program that we use to help employees meet their deductibles and that sort of thing. Anyway, those conventional things were looked at by the Employee Benefits Committee and came to some pretty good conclusions about you can adjust some of your premiums by increasing deductibles. But then the question becomes, when do those deductibles become so burdensome on the employees that you then have to supplement with a VIBA program or something like that? So spent a lot of time on that. But it wasn't getting us the type of sustainable program that we were really looking for, the ability to maintain those good benefits for our employees. So we wanted to look at some different models, and one of those models was a self-funding model. There have been different cities around Idaho that have used self-funded models in the past. City of Burley is one of them, fairly small city in southeastern Idaho. They probably think that they're just southern Idaho, not southeastern. And City of Lewiston also is self-insured. There are some other, Chad will tell you about some of the regulations with the Department of Insurance that make it more inviting to be self-funded. He'll talk about risk and that sort of thing. What we wanted to do was come in and have the council look at this as a potential for us, and Chad will explain how that's being done. The idea is not to put more risk on the city, although we will be assuming if the council moves to go forward, and we're still in the investigatory stages at this time. But we'll talk about ways to mitigate that risk as well. What it does do, it allows us to take some of the profitability, administrative costs that are currently being charged by our full service health insurance carrier, Regents Blue Shield, and trying to keep those within the city so that we're able to provide better benefits at a more efficient rate and more efficient cost. And with that, I will turn it over to Chad to give his presentation. I'm sure you'll have some questions. We'll answer them as best we can. But Chad can go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks for having me tonight to talk about this. I know some of you have heard this already, so I'll try to move through it fairly quickly. And I think what I want to do is make sure you understand maybe the process that we went through to get to where we're at, and understand the difference between fully insured, which what the city has now, and self-insured, and then kind of where the pros and cons are with each of those programs, and where your experience has been over the past few years. And like Gary mentioned, we're just trying to figure out if this makes sense for you. There's a next step that we'll kind of talk about in the timeline. But I'm going to try to use this a little bit to kind of educate a little bit on those differences so you have a good understanding of what that looks like. So I'm going to move through this. So this is when we sit down with a client and we talk about a long-term benefit strategy, we try to get clients to look longer than just 1 year. I mean, a lot of clients, they're budgetary, they look year after year. We really want to try to look long-term, because if we continue to look year after year, healthcare costs aren't going down. You read all the articles, you see everything that's in the news, pharmaceutical, just different healthcare things that are happening. Costs are not necessarily going down. So our job is to try to sustain that for as long as possible. And so we try to go through this 4-step process with our clients, and one of them is just vitals for change. Is the organization that we're working with interested in making some change? Some aren't. Some just want to continue to do it the way they're doing. But then some are ready for change. And then also, what does the market bear? In our market, here, especially in the Northwest, there hasn't been as many clients go self-funded. If you look back east, there is a ton of self-funded business. And especially in the state of Idaho, there hasn't been as much self-funded business, especially for your size group. Typically, self-funding, we didn't really start talking about until you were 500 employees and above. And actually, healthcare reform, and I'll explain a little bit about why, but healthcare reform actually initiated some of this market disruption because of some taxes and things that happens for employers that go self-funded. They don't have to pay some of the taxes, and I'll explain that in a little more detail. And then kind of the second step that we go through is a baseline. We try to gauge from leadership and different groups within the organization about, is their understanding for change. And this is kind of the process that we're in right now. Last Monday, we met with the advisory committee and the employee and benefits committee. We met with the managers, and then we also met with the admin council to kind of start gauging the interest in this. And then we create a strategy, which we've already kind of done that step, and then our options going forward. And I'll kind of explain a little bit more about what the options look like. But as we went through our process with the benefits committee and the administration, these are some of the things we took into consideration. What are the priorities? Affordable benefits for the employees, like Gary said, we want to try to continue to provide those good benefits package for as long as we can. Provide some employee choice. Ensure healthcare benefit strategy and solutions are relevant to the employees. We want to make sure that what's going on in the marketplace, it's that what you're offering, you have that same benefits program that you're competing with other employers to get out there. And actually, as the labor market has gotten a lot tighter, benefits are actually becoming even much more important to those employees that are coming on. Like I said, continue to offer competitive benefits program. We'll talk about promoting a well-being and a culture of wellness. When you go self-funded, that's one of the things we really want to promote, is that a more engaged workforce, and I'll speak a little bit more to that later on. We want to continue to manage costs and budget. And then this triple aim approach that we take is improve the health of the city's employee population, improve the overall patient experience, and improve the sustainability of the healthcare program. So these are just some of the things that we took into consideration as we were developing our strategy. Cost priorities, these are some of the same things we just talked about. And then employee priorities, maximizing employee benefit choices, talked about that. Empower employee benefit accountability, that's the engaged workforce that I'll talk about a little bit more. Offer programs to support employee health improvement, and then access to consumer-driven engagement. So it isn't necessarily your employees, or even just employees in general, that they haven't been an engaged employee when it comes to healthcare, because co-pays and deductibles have been fairly low in the past, and, they go to the doctor and they don't necessarily know what that costs. They just know when they give them their card, it's only going to cost them $20. So one of the things that we'll continue to talk about is a more engaged workforce and a potentially more of a consumer-driven health plan, especially if you go self-funded. But we need to give the employees those tools so that they can make those good informed decisions, so. And then this slide is more around just to orient you with how we look at health plans. The care delivery is really the network. And so right now you have Regents PPO network, which is our preferred provider network. And there's lots of different things you can do with networks, especially if you go self-funded. There's different direct contracts that you can do with certain hospitals and things like that. But really this care delivery is how your employees access that care. And then employee health, that's that engaged workforce, looking after the physical well-being of those employees. This is really what an employer can do to influence the behavior of their employees. Because if we're going to continue to offer health insurance, we want them to be engaged and understand, what their, how to be better stewards of their health care plan. And then the program design, that's really like co-pays, deductibles, those kinds of things, how we design that plan. And then the delivery infrastructure is really how we fund the plan. This is really the category that we're going to focus on tonight, which is around the self-funding. And I'll kind of explain a little bit more about that in the next slide here. So like Gary said, right now you pay Regents Blue Shield of Idaho to take the risk of your health plan. So if you have 10 cancer claims and they cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, you pay your monthly premium to Regents and they cover all that risk and pay those claims on your behalf. So you know exactly what your monthly costs are going to be and really your annual costs will be. In a self-funded plan, you really are taking the risk of that. And I'll talk a little bit about the different components and how we're going to mitigate that risk. But you really are taking that risk now. You're no longer going to pay somebody else to take that risk. The city of Moscow is going to take on that, what we call fiduciary responsibility of the health plan. So, and the one thing that, as we move through this process, with the city, there are lots of different ways you can self-fund. But one of the ways that the area that we landed on is this, what we call the administrative services only. And this is what we call an ASO agreement. And so the idea of this is the city of Moscow would go self-funding and stay with Regents Blue Shield of Idaho, but be self-funded. So even though they're a fully insured carrier and they have lots of fully insured business, they do self-insured business and you pay them to pay your claims. And I'll explain some of the other pieces, the components of that. The other way you can go about it, you can say, we're not going to use Regents Blue Shield of Idaho. We're going to go hire a third-party administrator, and all they do is pay claims. You pay them a monthly fee, and they pay claims, and that's all they do. And you have to go out and find the other components that I'm going to talk about here in just a minute to bundle that with. Then the other way that employers self-fund is they self-administer, which is not something that we would recommend. We have no clients that self-administer their health plan because you don't want to see that health information come across HR's desk. So, but that's the administrative piece of the plan. And like I said, right now you pay Regents Blue Shield of Idaho a monthly fee that includes all of this already. And then administrative fee, like I said, it's to pay the claims, billing, eligibility, customer service, all those types of things. And then, so in a self-funded arrangement, you're still going to pay Regents Blue Shield of Idaho an administrative fee. So they're going to pay a per employee per month fee for this. And then we're also going to come up with what we call an expected claims. And this will make a little more sense as I get farther into the presentation, but you're going to have an expected claim. So expected claims, if you think about that, that's what the underwriters and actuaries say, what it's going to cost to cover your plan to pay all the claims for the year. So right now, I think your plan runs right around 1.4 million or something like that. When the underwriters come up with the expected claims, they're going to take all your fixed costs and what they think you're going to pay in claims, and that's going to be what we're talking about as your expected claims. But then as you take all this risk on, the idea with self-insurance is that you put additional insurance layers in there to protect you, so in case of some catastrophic claims come in, you're going to be protected. So you're going to have your administrative fee to Regents, and then we're also going to pay what we call a stop-loss fee to Regents to reinsure claims over a certain amount. And so that claim, that stop-loss point might be $50,000. So if you think about, if I go and have claims at the doctor's office and they're $65,000, it's $65,000. City of Moscow is going to pay the first $50,000 of that, and then the stop-loss, the reinsurance, is going to cover up that next $15,000. So So if that claim's 500,000, the reinsurance is going to pick up anything over that 50,000. So that's how you're protecting yourself for the risk of, on an individual claim. So within the city, and this has nothing to do with the employee's individual deductible or anything like that. That's just on a claim basis. If I go have a claim and it's 100,000 and we set your limit at 50,000, you're reinsured for anything over that. And then we have another layer of insurance that we layer in for the self-funded plan. That's the aggregate stop loss. And so if we have a whole bunch of individual claims that go over the expected claims amount, then there's an aggregate stop loss insurance that's going to cover anything beyond that. So let's just, for simple numbers, if we say that your expected claims were $1 million for this next year, and we had a whole bunch of claims and your actual claims end up being 1.3 million, we would have an aggregate layer in there that covers you at 125% of your expected claims, which means 1.25 million. So that's your maximum liability if really the wheels come off. And a whole bunch of individual claims meet up to that aggregate level. And so you not only will have an individual stop loss layer, you have an aggregate stop loss layer on the plan. So your liability is known. There's never going to be a year where you don't know what your maximum liability is going to be.
Yeah, will both of these change every year depending on what you anticipate claims will be?
Every year they can change, but every year that's up to the city. And so they're going to charge you a fee. And just for simple numbers, let's say it's $50 per employee per month that they're going to charge for that stop loss insurance for a $50,000 deductible. They're always going to try to increase that fixed cost amount, potentially, depending on your claims experience. And so you might say, well, we were okay with the 50,000 last year, and based on our history of claims, we're going to raise that to 75,000, and we're going to save a little bit of money because we know that, hopefully it'll pay off in the end. So you're really in charge of that. The insurance carrier they can't adjust that on you on their own.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Kind of a similar question. So the individual stop loss insurance amount, fee, or, there are different levels, just like there would be, say, with deductibles, just depending on what you want that limit to be?
Yep.
Like this 50,000 costs X amount and 75,000?
Yep.
Okay, so in the proposals will give those options?
Absolutely,
Okay.
yep. And typically, a general underwriting rule of thumb is you set your spec deductibles, and we'll go through all this information in more detail, but at 7 to 11% of your total claims. And so they're really, for your size group, we'll kind of have a recommended. I just had a group your size, the city of Moscow's size, go self-funded, and they actually decided to go with the 50,000. The underwriting guidelines said they should go at 75, but their propensity for risk, they just felt more, they wanted to pay a little extra money to have that spec be lower for the first couple years. So. So this is just really an example to try to illustrate what I was just talking about. If for this example, you have a $127,000 claim, the spec deductible is $25,000, so the cities would be responsible for the first $25,000, and the insurance company would be responsible for the additional $102,000. So, and then anything between the 0 and 25 in this example goes to your aggregate level. So in the situation where, let's say everybody had a claim, which has never happened, but something catastrophic happened, that aggregate level still is there to protect if everybody has, hits the spec deductible in their claims. So that's kind of that's a really quick explanation of self-funding. So if there is any specific questions, please ask me, because I went through that fairly quickly. The point I want to get across a little bit too is that your current arrangement with Regents Blue Shield of Iowa, even though it's fully insured, if you've got high claims in that year, they're going to charge you for that regardless. And there typically usually is profit built into that fully insured arrangement because they're taking the risk. They're going to charge a little more. In the self-funded world, it's going to look very much the same because the strategy we're looking at is to stay with Regents. So at least to the employees, it's going to look and feel very much the same. But the fixed costs are going to be really transparent. So we're going to know exactly what they're charging for administrative fees. We're going to know what they're charging for the stop loss, and we're going to know what they're charging you for the aggregate level. And then it's just your claims. And you already are paying that in your fully insured contract. They just add some profit within that. And there's also some tax advantages that I'll talk about here a little bit further. So just real briefly, as we do talk with employers about going self-funded, we work with a lot of employers that obviously start fully insured and move to the self-funded world, and it can be a little bit scary. But a lot of things that we look at is just risk tolerance. You know, how does the group understand the risk they're taking on, and what's their tolerance for that? And I would say, just from the conversations we've had with administration, I have a real high comfort level with the understanding of the risk that the city would be taking on, and how we're mitigating that, and how they're going to fund certain things. And we'll talk in more detail at some point about some of the reserves and surpluses that are required. But these are some of the first things I investigate. And then, how is the plan run historically? One of the last slides we'll talk a little bit about some of your historical claims experience. The city of Moscow's plan has run historically really pretty well. You fund some of the dependent premium, which allows the plan to really be more sustainable, because there's more premium in the pot to pay those claims and keep those real high years from happening. But really, your claims experience, and we've even looked back over the last 10 years. We don't have that data with us today, but we're getting that data to show you in the graph a full 10 years. And you can see where in the years where Regents is making money, and the last 4 years they've been making money, which they're taking the risk. So I don't necessarily disagree with that. But and then employers, workforce, stable turnover. Obviously, the city has a pretty stable workforce. I know there's been some recent retirements and things like that. But if I was talking to an employer where they had 40 or 50% turnover within a year, that may not be a good employer to go self-funded, because we don't really know the risk of the new people coming in. We really understand, because of the claims history that you've had, how the city performs, and really what the claims are like over a 10-year period of time. So stable workforce is good. Rate and plan design history, really you guys have had, like Gary mentioned, you've been with Regents for a long time, which a lot of employers, especially in North Idaho, have kind of jumped around from the different carriers to try to chase the rates. You guys have done a really good job of keeping that stable over the years and trying to keep your plan design fairly stable. And then employer philosophy towards providing benefits. Do I have to offer a plan to stay competitive, or I want to offer a plan to take care of my employees, or both? I think typically we'll avoid employers that want to just dip their toe in the water in self-funding. If they're just trying to check the bucket on their they're offering benefits, and they complain about that cost every year, but they really don't want to really focus on it. They're probably not a great employer to go self-funded, because there is another level of attention that it takes to go self-funded to detail. So if the city were to talk about trying to dip their toe in the water and just see if this is something, it probably wouldn't be a good option. But also on those same lines, if we do go down this road, even and you go self-funded, and we find out it's not a good option, you can go back to the fully insured side of the market. So, yeah.
So would that be at the end of each year of the plan, you would have that option, or can that happen at any time?
You can really do it at any time. You can end your self-insured contract. There is some run out of claims and things that happen when you're self-insured, but you can start your fully insured contract really at any time. We would probably advise it to be at the end of the year, but. And then kind of the other point that we talk with employers about is the philosophy towards promoting wellness. If you're going to go self-funded, you want your workforce to be more engaged. You want them to understand what these things are costing, because it's their health plan. We'll talk a little more of how this is going to be structured, but it's really going to be, there's going to be a health plan trust. And so this is really going to be the employee's money, the trust's money going forward. So they need to understand how to be good stewards of this going forward. So I know the city in the past has invested some dollars in wellness, and will probably continue to do more if they go down this road. And that's really an important key to being self-funded. And this is just a real brief pros and cons list of being self-funded. Cash flow under the current fully insured arrangement, there are monthly premium payments. If the plan is self-funded, the city holds reserves. So in the example of this, let's just say that the city pays $100,000 a month to Regents, and that's your fully insured premium. If your claims that month were only $30,000, Regents still keeps that $100,000 in premium. In the case of a self-funded arrangement, you're only paying your admin costs to Regents that month, and if your claims are low, you're keeping that additional money in reserves. But the flip side can happen if you have a high month, you could potentially have the cash flow, you could have to pay more than you normally would be in a fully insured arrangement. Plan design flexibility control. This is just, when you go self-funded, you have a lot more control over the flexibility of designing the plan, what networks you can use down the road. I mean, there's just a whole tool chest of things that you can do when you go self-funded. The idea, that the strategy that we have in place that we're looking at, we wouldn't be doing anything really crazy outside the box to start with. Really, we would have a more conservative approach, which is that ASO agreement with Regents, but there are lots of options for down the road. Cost efficiencies with the monthly claims reconciliation and the competitive administrative fee, there does not appear to be undue profit. That's what I just explained. The carriers aren't keeping the profit in a self-funded arrangement. Not subject to most state mandated benefits. This doesn't necessarily apply to the city of Moscow. The state of Idaho has, I think, about 15 state mandated benefits that insurance carriers have to cover. When you go self-funded, you kind of get out of that world of being mandated that way. But all those 15 mandated benefits are things that you are going to offer. There's nothing really in there that you wouldn't. If we were just across over in Pullman, the state of Washington has about 46 mandated benefits. So there's some fully insured carriers that have to offer certain things. In a self-funded world, you don't have to. So it doesn't necessarily apply to the city. Employer holds reserves. We talked about that. Expanded availability of reporting. This doesn't necessarily apply to the city at this point. We already get really good data on your fully insured plan. Some self-insured people don't get data from their carriers. We do get your data from Regents, so this doesn't really change for you. And we don't get member detail. We just get aggregate level claims, so we never know who had the knee surgery or we just know that it happened. So. And then another pro is elimination of the state premium tax and also the ACA tax. So within your premiums for Regents, you pay a 1.5% tax on your premium that goes to the state of Idaho. And then you also pay about a 3 to 5% tax for healthcare reform. And Regents Blue Shield just passes those right down on to the city, and you pay those. When you go self-funded, right away those come off. So you'll have a savings of about 4.5% right away, just by not paying taxes on it. Minimal impact on plan participants, we talked about that. This really will look and feel very much the same to the employees. Stable workforce, more typical claims, talked about that. Flexibility and choice of carriers, like I said, when you go self-funded, it opens up a whole world of options that you can go down that road with, and to try to do more cost management and things like that to the plan. Some of the cons of going self-funded is claims fluctuation. Like I said, you pay your premiums to Regents, and you don't really care what your claims are necessarily. You care, but you aren't. Your finance department doesn't necessarily care because they're not writing an additional check. Within this arrangement, you can have a low month, you can have 2 low months, and you can have a high month or 2 high months. The cash flow is going to vary, and so there's some adjustments that'll have to be done within the finance to adjust to that. Talked about the potential financial risk. More involvement from the city's human resource and finance staff. Because of the arrangement that we're thinking about going down, there really is no more involvement from human resources. It's going to be very much the same as business as usual for them. There will be some training and things like that on the finance side to help kind of how the new billing and invoicing is going to happen. But once that happens, it's pretty straightforward. HIPAA compliance responsibilities, you already comply to all these things, so there's nothing going to be new on the self-funded world. And then the legal and fiduciary responsibility. So the Department of Insurance, because you're a public entity, they don't just allow you to go self-funded and get yourself into trouble. A private employer, like myself, I can go self-insure my employees' medical insurance, and the state doesn't care, because if I go belly up, that's my issue. But because you're a public entity, the Department of Insurance does regulate this process. And so there's more things that we're doing with that that aren't required by other employers. So, and I don't know, should I go into the makeup of the trust and things like that?
Certainly.
Okay. One of the things that the Department of Insurance requires is that the city set up a board of trustees to manage the finances of this. And the board of trustees is going to be made up of 5 folks. We think some from administration and some from, I think, the employee side. The Department of Insurance does not allow city council or the mayor to be on those because they're decision makers within that, and they want the decision makers of the health plan, the money that's in the health plan, to be separate from that. And so there's a whole process that'll happen to put that in place. And we've already had a phone conversation with the Department of Insurance to kind of work through some of those things with them. And they wanted to have a phone conversation with the city to see how much you understood about what you were getting into. And we spent, over the last year, Gary has spent lots of time with our own attorney from our organization. He's an ERISA attorney. He actually resides in Boise, very familiar with how the Department of Insurance works with them weekly. And him and Gary have spent a lot of time getting up to speed on the code, what's required. And so when we had that call with the Department of Insurance, they were very impressed with actually how much the city knew about what they were getting into, and those, because they usually find that people aren't as educated in those areas. And so that was a really good first call with the Department of Insurance to at least we give them a heads up that the city may be going down this road. We don't want to surprise them with just throwing an application in the mail to them. We want to, and they were very excited to potentially see an application. And then this other bullet point is just about fiduciary responsibility. I don't know if I have to beat that one anymore, but that really is, the city of Moscow becomes the fiduciary responsible, they're responsible for the health plan. That board of trustees really is responsible for the finances with the health plan. They don't make the health plan choices as far as like plan designs and like that, but how it's financed, they are managers of that money, so. So this is a bit of a timeline that we were working off of. We put together a full benefit strategy kind of as we're working through this process, and I've mentioned a few of these, but I'm looking for the laser. Oops, that's not it. Okay. So back in April, we had that call with the Department of Insurance. We actually reached out and had a phone call and gave them a heads up. And then we scheduled an actual phone call with the administration and the Department of Insurance and the Murray Group. And that went very well. The next process is to engage an actuary. So the Department of Insurance is also, not only they're requiring the trustee, to put together the board of trustees, they're requiring the city have actuarial certification that you can actually fund this plan. So they're not going to let you go forward if the actuaries actually take a look at this and they say, this doesn't look good for the city, and we don't think you should go down this road. And so really the next steps after this process would be to engage with an actuary and get those numbers back. And it's a requirement that DOI to move forward, but for you to also kind of see where those numbers come back with. Probably towards the end of the month, depending how the decisions go here, there'll be kind of the selection of the trustees. And they go through quite the process. They do the biographical affidavits. They want to know everything about you. They want to understand the person's finances. They don't want somebody that's a trustee that potentially doesn't know how to manage their own finances to manage millions of dollars in a trust. So they're going to vet out who you decide you want to be in the trust. And around that August timeframe, we would submit the application and the actuarial analysis to the Department of Insurance. And then at that point, they can take up to 90 days to approve whether you can go self-funded or not. And so the idea of this is we submit this to them in early September with a go-live date for the plan to go self-funded January 1 of 2019. All the while we're doing this, the city's fully insured plan renews August 1st. We would renew that for, say, 12 months. You can end that at any point, but we'd make sure that's in place just in case the Department of Insurance comes back and says, no, you can't go self-funded. We still have that fully insured plan in place and no interruptions at that point. So, any questions on that? And this is an experience dashboard that we look at on a monthly basis on your behalf. We monitor the city's claims experience because we can tell whether the renewal may not be favorable coming up because we can see the experience of the group. And I won't go through this in detail. Really, the slide that's the most important is really this slide right here. This is a 4-year snapshot. Excuse me, I probably need to stay behind this. A 4-year snapshot of your claims experience. So each one of those points that you'll see here is what we call your loss ratio for that month. And your loss ratio is pure claims. So for every dollar that the city pays to Regents, they're paying, in this instance, I can't even read that from here, is that 66%? And so for every dollar that you paid Regents, they paid 66 cents in claims that month. And so you can see how the claims fluctuate throughout the months, depending on what's going on within the group. And so, but that red line right there, that's your expected claims. That's where, that's the premiums that you're paying. And so for every month that you're below that red line, Regents, you're paying more than what you're actually paying in claims. And so you can see, and then this other line right here, this thinner line, is your trend line. So over the last 4 years, your claims have been trending down, which is pretty rare. I usually see them kind of creeping up this way, but the city's claims has actually trended down. And there's also been a request for this same exact graph to look at the last 10 years. And so we're working on putting that together. We have our underwriting department working on that to kind of see what the last 10 years looks like. But you can really see each of these months are months where the cash flow, you're going to be banking some money away, not to use for, to go pave roads or anything like that, but to put in the trust to help offset years because for every good year, there's about for every bad year, there's about 5 good years. So about 2 to 3 out of 10 years we are usually bad years. And when I say bad years, that's when your claims are mostly above this red line. And there's no way to predict those claims. If there's a cancer claim that happens or whatever, it just, it happens and the plan pays for it. So, but really the plan's experience has been functioning really well. I feel comfortable with where the data's at. If it was kind of going in the opposite direction, I would maybe even hesitate at that point. So that's really all I had for this presentation. Is there any additional questions or anything I could answer?
I had a question for Gary. You had mentioned that, and maybe Chad may know this as well, Lewiston has been doing this program. For how long have they been doing it? Does anybody?
Yeah, they're, I don't know the exact timeline, but it's been over 15 years.
And so their success rate, I mean, it must be impressive, or they wouldn't continue doing it.
Yeah, I think, like, the way we look at those really is, it's the fully insured, they're with Regents also, and so if you're fully insured, you're really, if you have high claims, they're going to charge you for that eventually. That's going to come out in those premiums eventually. So if you ask City of Lewiston, I think it's Dan Marsh down there, he would probably say they've come out ahead because, they've done it for a while and there's no profit built into the plan they have now, and so they don't pay the taxes from healthcare reform. And we just worked on a project for them to get them up to compliance with it. They weren't in compliance with the Department of Insurance because I don't think they've been so funded for so long. The DOI hasn't necessarily always been on top of things, and so we worked on a project just to get them up to speed, and so they have no intentions of not being self-funded going forward. So,
And I think the self-insurance piece of it, as I said, Burley, I know, was self-insured for a lot of years. They recently, within the last 5 years, joined the IIIA, which is a self-insured consortium similar to ICRIM. And that has a mixed result, but they're getting back on their feet and that sort of thing. But they're a fairly small city. I think they're about 9,500 people or something like that. And they saw early on that they were able to save some money with self-insurance. And again, the object is not just to save money. The object is to get the most efficient use of your dollars so you can keep providing those sort of benefits. As Chad indicated, the next step, we're still in the phase of investigating this. Murray's done just a great job pulling stuff together. I have been wanting to take a look at self-insurance for probably the last dozen years, but recent changes have made it more affordable. Department of Insurance is more comfortable with regulating it at this point. Additional taxes have made it the premiums higher on fully funded programs, so it becomes a better deal if you can manage the risk. The stop losses that Chad is talking about, That additional level of insurance allows us to limit our risk, which is a huge deal. You don't want to be out there for when the bad year comes and you have to dig deeper into your wallet. If you've taken care of that within those limitations, that 125% limitation, that's really where you want to be. And as we gain experience, we'll know where to set our stop losses and how to maximize those type of dollars. The trend line that Chad talks about up there, I'm very proud of the employees. The employees have taken care of their own health to a great extent. We have wellness programs. That's just a function of fewer claims by more employees. So it's really worked out well. So I think we're pretty uniquely positioned to be able to engage our employees in their own health care. I tell the story of several years ago, they came out with some drugs that were being advertised on TV, and people were taking this. It was the purple pill, if you remember that, Nexium, and everybody was taking Nexium. We brought a guy out of, or Regents, I should say, brought a fellow out of Boise who talked to our employees and said, you know what? Yeah, your doctors are going to prescribe this because it's the best new thing. But if you go to your pharmacy or even ask your doctor, can I get a generic rather than the name brand, you can cut a huge, I believe it was like 40% of what the Nexium price was. And they were very comparable drugs. And everybody, this little light bulb went off, especially when that representative said, yeah, you can have it. If your doctor says that's what you have to have, then we're obligated to give it to you. But whatever you're spending this year, if it's all expensive stuff, next year you're going to pay a premium for that, and it's going to adjust up. And as I indicated, we've had some years that we've gone up 11%, and that's a factor of that. So as we continue to investigate this, we'll continue to work with Josh Sears, who's the attorney for the Murray Group. Has been very informative on, as we go through this and we're stepping through each hoop, what we need to do. But the next step is we do need to engage an actuary. I've talked to the council in the past that we currently have some funding in the administration budget that had been intended to be used for consultants in conjunction with our bond, which we've delayed until fiscal 2019. So it's probably going to be around $15,000, and I've talked to the council about utilizing that funding for this actuarial analysis. Murray is not an actuary, so they need to contract that out. And we really want actuaries who are used to doing this, because we want to go in with our eyes wide open, and we present it to council. We want the council to understand, okay, this is what it is. This is our best estimate of what's going to happen. Department of Insurance is okay with it. Our actuarial data supports moving forward with this. So at this point, what we're looking for is direction from the council that we can continue with this investigation and bring it forward. Of course, once all that information is developed, we'll come back to council with that. And of course, when it is time to submit the actual application to the Department of Insurance, that will also be separate council action. So you need to be comfortable with the information once we develop it.
Brandy?
I have two quick questions, probably for you, Gary. So does the city determine the employee's premium and deductible?
No, it is,
Okay.
well, we can impact it by our selection of deductibles and things like that. But typically, what happens is, to coincide with our budget year, usually about April, something like that, Nellie will call up Regents and say, okay, it's time to get ready for the budget and the renewal of the City of Moscow's insurance. So they will give her a number. And it's going to be 12% above what it was last year. Then she'll come back, we'll talk about it, she'll go back and negotiate with Regents, and usually it comes down at something lower than that. And as I indicated, for the last 12 years, it's been about 5.5%. Some years as little as 0, some years 11%. So they tell us, if you want the same package that you had last year, this is what it's going to cost you, even though you negotiate and come to an amount. So the only direct impact we have is by adjusting the benefits that we're covering, if that makes sense.
the huge impact we have from a risk standpoint is this wellness program for employees making, and I think the city does a very good job of that. What I've seen as a mayor. So Art?
How do we set up for the first few months of this to handle any claims that come in and say we get that spike right out the gate?
Yes, and I think I figured you would probably have that question. As we're working with Josh and with the Department of Insurance, once we get the actuarial data, we can then start to look at how do we fund it. And it may be that we need to seed it with something. So we'll go through that. Typically, as Chad said, there will be a tail off of claims or a run out of claims. So for a while, regions will continue to pay the claims that they're responsible for, and we will begin to pay the claims that we're responsible for. So however that goes. The Department of Insurance, though, will require us to have reserves in place to be able to pay these claims. When we bring the proposal to you, it will come with an entire funding scenario as well. And of course, we call them premiums now that we pay them to regions. In our own system, they will be contributions. So the contributions will be set very much the same way that Regions sets their premiums. You'll look at your experience, you'll look at what your administrative costs are, and then you will be able to determine what your premium or your contribution will be for the next year. Now, hopefully, if the trend line goes where it is, we should be banking funds that are not paid out on a yearly or a monthly basis, and they accumulate in that trust, as Chad said, creating that reserve that if we get into the bad year, we're able to reach in and mitigate that so we don't have to pass on huge increases to either the city paying for the employee and half the dependents, or to the employee for paying for their half the dependents. But all that information will be fleshed out in the proposal.
Bill, as a kind of follow-up to Art's question, so if the first year was just bad, and even though we had a reserve, it went beyond that, where do we get that from?
Okay, that's the stop-loss insurance
Okay.
you heard.
Yep, so you would set that amount in the reserve to start with?
No, you're
Okay.
set with 125% of your experience, your actuarial data, correct? And we would have that or have that available. Then we would insure that additional risk. If we had a year of 170%, that's higher than 125%. So our secondary insurance, our stop loss individually and stop loss in the aggregate would help fund or would fund anything above that 125%.
I move to review presentation and direct staff to proceed with the development of a self-funded city employee health insurance proposal for city council consideration.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion by Catherine and a second by Gina to direct staff to proceed with the development of a self-funded city health insurance proposal for the city council's consideration. Further questions? I'll start the roll. Brandy?
Aye.
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 Hey,
Thank you very much for that nice presentation, Marley, and we will move on. That is the last of our items on the agenda, so we'll go into reports. I'll start with you, Gina.
Oh, goodness, okay. On the 14th of May, I went to the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department meeting. The excitement, other than paying some bills, was the fact that we are going to have a new engine very soon, and I did see a picture of it just before the meeting tonight. It's pretty shiny and new and says Moscow on the side. It's awesome. So, but that was really cool, and they do at each of these meetings then bring in new ambulance company members as well. So there's we brought in 3 this last month, and that was pretty exciting. And then on May 15th, I had the honor of reading a proclamation for Skilled Nursing Week at Aspen Park, and that was really cool in that when Aspen Park, as you may or may not know, was purchased by Cascadia about 6 months ago-ish. And that was a business that had actually contacted Moscow and was looking to move here. And it was kind of a cool moment to be able to have this proclamation, which was really cool, and the whereas and the wherefores and that what, but also with this company that now is part of our ecosystem here in Moscow. So I'm pretty excited. It was really a really cool thing. I will tell you that the women at Aspen Park have no problem with rain in their hair. And we were standing there reading this whereas and therefores in the rain. Raindrops everywhere, and they were like, "Go, sister." So it was really fun. So that's what I got to do the last month.
Jim?
That's it, huh?
That's it.
Last week I went to the Human Rights Commission and there was no quorum, so there wasn't much decided there, but members of the commission are still looking for things that might be human rights issues around the county and the city that we can work to mitigate, and that's what's going on there. Also went to the Pollution Basin Aquifer Committee meeting last week, and we had a great presentation by a grad student who was doing a project on where the recharge for the aquifer is coming. And apparently in this area, a lot of that water comes off the mountain into the bedrock and into the aquifer that way. And a lot of it in the Pullman area comes down the streams. It recharges from the Palouse River and Paradise Creek and whatnot. And those two sources of recharge kind of meet in the middle. And so there's new data coming to light about where the water comes from, and they're doing a lot of radioisotope research on how old that water is, and noble gas, using noble gases and radioisotopes to determine how long that water's been in the ground, or how long it took to get from the mountain to Pullman, for instance. And so that's quite interesting. There's a lot of research progress going on there. On the financial side of things, the current budget of PBAC is we're spending more than we're actually taking in from the entities that contribute. There's a large reserve fund that's going to cover that, but that's going to be an issue that we're going to have to deal with in the future. We're either going to have to decide that we've had enough research and make a decision, or we're going to have to add some more money to the pot.
Randy?
Okay, the Pathways Commission met on May 8th, and looking forward to the Bike to Work Day, which was kind of cold, but they had some people turn out, and the KLEW came and interviewed them. They've also been just still primarily working on planning the next bike tour venue, and are hoping maybe they can incorporate the new underpass into that, just if the timing works out. I think the timeline says it will be substantially completed by the time that they want to do that. So I think they may be, as the time gets closer, wanting to see if they can have permission to have people at least maybe walk through. And the Sustainable Environment Commission, Paul Kimmel from Avista gave a very cool and interesting report on a solar farm in Adams County in Lind, Washington, where they have 200 acres of panels. And so it was just very interesting to look at that as a economic driver there. And there was discussion about the upcoming, Paul was involved in this too, potential merger settlement agreement between Avista and Hydro One. That's a company in Ontario, Canada, and they've already merged with Avista in Washington. So there's a proposal for that. They'll be accepting public input. Some of the members of Sustainable Environment Commission, just as citizens, requested that one of these hearings be held in Moscow, and it will be on June 12th in the 1912 Center. So if anyone's interested, you can hear about if you think it's a pro or a con to have that merger happen. One of the things SEC was excited about is that merger would accelerate the divestment from Colstrip in Montana. And there's also a lot of excitement about the pesticide-free park that's going to happen at Otness Park, and just some details about continuing to work with Dwight Curtis from Parks and Rec on that and how that's all going to go, and wanting to be supportive of that and seeing if there can be some information that could be provided to help with alternatives. So that's something that they're working on.
Quick question for you, Brandy. Was Otness selected because it's small, or were there other factors?
I'm not sure. I didn't hear from Dwight directly why.
Yeah, mostly because it's one of our very smallest parks.
And also maybe because it's a little bit newer, I think there was some idea that a newer park might be a good first test.
And there will be, if I may, there will be some challenges. It does border the creek, and so there are noxious weeds that need to be controlled, and it's going to be an interesting test to see what happens.
Actually, that leads me to just mention one quick thing about Clearwater RC&D. I had that also. And the Potlatch Youth, what is it called?
Conservation
Yes,
one?
yep. So Potlatch is a new one this summer, and they are actively looking for some summer projects. So I was asked if the city of Moscow might want to employ them for a number of days or maybe a week, and I passed that along to Gary, so he's aware of that. But if anyone has some, speaking about the weeds, that's what made me think of it.
Sure.
So they are going to be working for the county for a couple days, doing some noxious weed management. So that's it.
Okay. Catherine?
I have no report.
Okay, what is it?
PKC continues to work on the boot camp that's coming up this June 11 to 14. The Moscow Urban Renewal Agency met and regrettably had to cancel the DDA with Sangria, so 6th and Jackson is going to be back in the market again. The URA will be working with Palouse Commercial to remarket that area and include a larger area of advertising for potential people who might be interested in picking that up and developing it. Also proceeding with a duplicate of the undercross at Steiner White and Highway 8 and looking at maybe putting another one under Highways 8 and 95, so that's progressing. And also initiated a Phase 2 environmental assessment of some property near the corner of 8 and 95. It's in the process of being redeveloped now that it's probably going to be clear of the floodplain, depending on what the feds have to say about that. So the URA continues marching ahead despite a bit of a setback with the Sangria project, but it'll get done yet. So it's going to be going out for RFPs again here pretty quick.
Okay, man.
Planning and zoning met on May 9th, and there were a couple topics of discussion that I'll be emailing you all about, because I think it warrants a council level discussion. And the two that were brought up by citizens and discussed at length were how you address little, I don't know what to call them, orphan sidewalks outside of new development, and also the cost of land, the way that the city values land. So the developers were given a choice to develop a park or to pay a fee, and the fee they ended up paying was about $500. And so everybody thought that was pretty low, and that I think it merits a discussion with the council. So that's all from me.
Okay, I only have one thing.
Oh, if I could just, if that comes up again with the orphan sidewalk thing, it might be nice to see if they want to connect with Pathways, because they're interested in all these orphan pathway things too,
orphan
and
paths,
connecting.
they call
So maybe suggest that.
Yeah,
Those
I'll
two
make a note of
commissions
that.
may want to get together.
John Graydon.
Okay, on May the 16th, I missed the poverty on a Palouse to attend the 13 Ways to Kill Your Community by Doug Griffiths. And Gina, of course, was there, and Brandy as well came in. And that was a very interesting presentation. That was kind of and we had other leaders from other communities. The mayor from Potlatch was here, Bolville, Deary, and Julietta, yes. And so we got a nice intertwined of various people. So it was kind of an interesting presentation. I'm looking forward to reading his book. So, Gary, do you have anything?
I have nothing, sir.
Okay, I would entertain a motion to adjourn to executive session per Idaho Code 74-206, 1B, 1C, and 1F, and this meeting will not reconvene.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. We'll move to executive session. I'm going to run to the restroom real quick.